Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where we slow things down, take a closer look at the world around us, and occasionally discover that the world around us is much stranger than it first appears. Tonight we're heading into a landscape that millions of people have walked across without seeing most of what lies underneath it. Because beneath the forests and limestone plains of the Maya world there are caves, flooded passages, underground chambers, sinkholes, and hidden waterways extending through the rock. Some of these places are enormous. Others begin as openings so small that you could pass them without realizing that anything important was there. To the ancient Maya, however, certain openings into the earth were not simply geological curiosities. They could be sacred places where the familiar human world came into contact with forces and beings belonging to another part of the cosmos, and that makes the ground beneath Maya cities one of the most interesting religious landscapes in the ancient Americas. Perhaps the easiest way into this subject is to imagine that you are walking through the northern Yucatan Peninsula, before modern roads, electric lights, pumps, geological surveys and cave diving equipment existed. The land around you is mostly flat. There are forests, cultivated areas, settlements, stone buildings, paths and fields. But in much of this region there are very few permanent rivers flowing across the surface. Rain falls, sometimes heavily, and then much of that water seems to disappear. It drains into the limestone beneath the ground, passing through cracks and openings that have been enlarged over immense periods of time. Beneath the surface, water collects and moves through caves and underground channels. Where sections of the limestone ceiling collapse, the groundwater can become exposed in natural sinkholes known today as cenotes. These range from broad open pools filled with sunlight to narrow entrances leading into dark, submerged cave systems. For Maya communities in parts of the northern lowlands, cenotes could provide crucial access to fresh water, which immediately gave them a practical importance that would have been impossible to ignore. Now imagine that you know nothing about dissolved limestone, underground aquifers, or the chemistry of slightly acidic rainwater. You simply know that water falls from the sky, vanishes into the ground, and can sometimes be reached again through openings in the earth. You may enter a cave and hear water somewhere ahead before you can see it. You may look down into a cenote and find a pool far below the surrounding surface. During dry periods, access to that water can become a matter of survival. During rainy periods, the same landscape changes again. From a modern geological point of view, there is nothing supernatural about any of this. From the point of view of people trying to understand a world in which water, agriculture, weather, death, fertility and divine power were closely connected, the underground landscape offered something much more significant than an interesting lesson in hydrology. Before we go any deeper, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight, and whether there are caves, springs, wells, tunnels, or other hidden places beneath the landscape around you. Most of us spend very little time thinking about what exists underneath the roads, houses, fields, and pavements we cross every day. We tend to treat the ground as a solid boundary. The useful world is above it, and everything underneath belongs to pipes, roots, worms, utility companies, and people carrying unusually expensive drilling equipment. The Maya lived in environments where that boundary could be much less secure. An opening in the earth might lead directly to water, to a cave containing evidence of earlier rituals, or to a place associated with gods, ancestors, death, rain, or other supernatural forces. In that kind of landscape, what lies below you is not an empty space. It is part of the world you live in. And while you're settling in, if these quiet journeys through archaeology, history and the natural world help you relax, you can give the video a like and subscribe to Just About Earth. It helps these longer explorations reach people who enjoy learning without being shouted at by a thumbnail every 30 seconds. Tonight's subject should be especially suitable for a calm evening, although whether an ancient Maya cave filled with offerings and stories about dangerous supernatural beings would have been considered relaxing is another question entirely. One thing we need to establish from the beginning is that there was never one single Maya society with one completely uniform religion. Maya civilization covered a large area that included parts of what are now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras and El Salvador, and Maya communities developed across many centuries. They spoke related but distinct languages, lived in different environments, built different political traditions, and expressed religious ideas in ways that could vary across regions and periods. Even today, there are many Maya peoples rather than one interchangeable group. This matters because popular accounts sometimes take one surviving Maya tradition, attach it to every ancient site, and give the impression that someone in northern Yucatan in 1 century necessarily described the supernatural world in exactly the same way as a Quiche Maya community in the Guatemalan highlands many centuries later. The evidence is more complicated and much more interesting. The word Xibalba is a good example. It is famous because of the Popol Vuh, the great narrative associated with the Quiche Maya of highland Guatemala. In that story, Xibalba is the dangerous realm ruled by supernatural lords of death, and it becomes the setting for one of the best-known episodes in Maya literature, the journey of Hunahpu and Xbalanque, the hero twins. The twins descend into this realm, encounter deceptive rulers and a series of deadly tests, and eventually overcome the powers that intend to destroy them. The story is extraordinary, and we will spend plenty of time there because it gives us one of our clearest surviving descriptions of an underworld that is not merely a vague place of shadows. Xibalba has roads, rulers, houses, trials, movement, conversation, tricks and danger. It behaves like somewhere that can be entered and travelled through. It would still be misleading to use Xibalba as though it was simply the universal ancient Maya word for every concept of the world below. The Popol Vuh comes from a particular Maya cultural and linguistic tradition, and ancient Maya religion was diverse. What is much broader, however, is the importance of caves, openings in the earth, mountains, water sources, and other features of the landscape in Maya ritual life. Archaeological investigations in caves across the Maya region have found pottery, burials, altars, monuments, traces of ritual activity, and other objects showing that people deliberately entered these environments for purposes far beyond shelter or collecting water. In caves in west-central Belize, for example, archaeologists documented vessels, pottery fragments, burials, altars, and ceremonial material associated with Maya ritual activity during the Classic period. The significance of caves as spiritually powerful places is supported not only by later stories, but by things people physically carried underground and left behind. That distinction is important because it brings us to the real question behind tonight's journey. We're not searching for evidence that an underground civilization of supernatural beings literally built cities beneath the Yucatan. Archaeologists have not discovered a stone palace occupied by death gods, and cave divers have not reported being stopped at a border checkpoint on their way into Xibalba. The interesting question is why generations of Maya people treated certain underground locations as places where relationships with the supernatural world could actually be established. They went there. They performed ceremonies there. They carried valuable or symbolically important objects into difficult spaces. At some sites, human remains were deposited there. This was religion expressed through physical movement and physical places, and the landscape itself helped give those beliefs form. To understand how powerful that experience could be, it helps to forget modern cave tourism for a moment. Today, a famous cave might have electric lighting, handrails, staircases, warning signs, mapped routes, ticket booths, and somebody at the entrance selling a refrigerator magnet. Ancient visitors had none of that. Entering deeply into a cave meant leaving daylight behind. A torch or other source of flame gave only limited visibility. Rock formations created unfamiliar shapes. The floor might be uneven or wet. Passages could narrow. Air and temperature could change as you moved inward. Sounds echoed in ways that made their sources difficult to locate. Water dripping somewhere beyond the light could be heard long before it appeared. A chamber that seems impressive under a modern lamp would have been experienced one small illuminated section at a time. If you entered believing that the cave was connected with supernatural beings or forces, those physical sensations would not have been separate from the ritual meaning of the place. Darkness, distance, water, strange formations, and the effort required to reach an interior chamber could all contribute to the significance of the journey. Archaeologists studying Maya caves have repeatedly found ritual material well inside underground spaces, sometimes in places that require deliberate effort to reach. That is an important clue. People do not normally carry valuable objects into difficult caves because they have suddenly become tired of owning them. When carefully placed offerings, special vessels, human remains, architectural modifications, or repeated traces of ceremony occur in these settings, the location itself becomes part of the evidence. Cenotes add another dimension because they connected sacred meaning with one of the most practical requirements of everyday life: water. Across the northern Yucatan, porous limestone means rainfall drains underground, instead of forming the extensive surface river systems found in many other regions. Cenotes therefore gave access to groundwater and were vital to communities living nearby. Archaeological research also shows that some cenotes were used for ritual purposes, while others seem to have served more ordinary domestic functions. This distinction is useful because it prevents us from imagining that every person drawing water from every sinkhole was performing a religious ceremony. The Maya were perfectly capable of needing a drink without turning the entire experience into a conversation with the supernatural. Context matters, and archaeologists look at patterns of deposits, human remains, unusual artifacts, and other evidence when deciding how a particular cenote was used. At places where ritual activity is clear, however, the evidence can be striking. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza became famous for objects and human remains recovered from its waters, and colonial accounts describe offerings made there during periods of drought. Later investigations of cenotes elsewhere in Yucatan reveal that this was part of a much larger pattern of human interaction with underground water. Archaeologists have found ceramic vessels, animal remains, human remains, and other material in submerged settings, and specialists have had to develop methods that combine archaeology with diving simply to reach some of these sites. The physical environment that once helped make these places mysterious still complicates their investigation today. There is something almost appropriate about that. Many centuries after the ceremonies ended, researchers still have to descend through narrow openings, enter dark water, follow submerged passages, and carefully work in a world that cannot be understood entirely from the surface. Modern divers carry equipment the ancient Maya could never have imagined, but the basic geography remains the same. Above is a dry or forested landscape. Below it is water moving through limestone. The difference is that modern science can map the chemistry, geology, depth, and connections of these systems, while ancient Maya communities explain their significance through a worldview in which natural and supernatural forces were not divided into the categories we use today. That point is easy to underestimate. Modern language encourages us to ask whether a sacred cave was really a geological formation or really a religious place, as though the two possibilities cancel each other out. To the people who used it, there was no reason they had to. A cave could contain actual water, actual rock, actual darkness, actual bats, and actual ceremonial deposits, while also being connected with supernatural power. A cenote could be a practical water source and a sacred opening. A mountain could be a physical landmark and a religious one. The environment did not stop being real when it became meaningful. In fact, the physical reality may have made the religious meaning stronger. Consider what the Maya could observe directly. Water genuinely did disappear into the ground. Caves genuinely did extend beyond the reach of daylight. Some passages really did lead to pools and underground streams. Human bodies placed in caves or cenotes genuinely disappeared from the ordinary world of the living. Voices genuinely changed when they echoed from stone chambers. Smoke genuinely behaved differently underground. The underworld did not need to be imagined as an invisible location somewhere far beyond experience, when the earth itself already contained places that looked and felt separate from everyday life. This is where the subject becomes more subtle than the familiar phrase, "The Maya believed caves were entrances to the underworld." That phrase is useful, but by itself it can make the belief sound almost childish, as though people simply saw a dark hole and decided monsters must live inside. Maya religious relationships with caves developed within a complex understanding of landscape, agriculture, political authority, ancestors, rain, fertility, death, and cosmic order. Caves could be associated with water and agricultural renewal, as well as with death. Mountains and caves could be understood as places from which essential resources emerged. Ritual specialists and rulers could use sacred locations to communicate with or make offerings to supernatural powers. The world below was dangerous, but dangerous did not mean useless or evil in the simple modern sense. Rain is a good comparison. A storm can destroy crops, flood settlements, and kill people, yet rain is also necessary for agriculture. Fire can burn a house down, yet it cooks food and provides heat. Water can sustain an entire city and still drown anyone who falls into the wrong place. Human societies frequently treat the forces they depend upon with a mixture of respect, gratitude, and fear. The underground world could operate in a similar way. It was connected with death, but also with water. It could contain dangerous beings, but people still approached it when they needed divine assistance. A sacred cave was not necessarily somewhere to avoid. It might be somewhere to enter carefully, under the right circumstances, with the right offerings and the right people. Evidence from Maya caves in Belize illustrates just how deliberate that interaction could be. Archaeological reports describe ceremonial deposits, pottery, burials, and ritual spaces, indicating that some caves were visited repeatedly rather than used once and forgotten. Research on Maya caves more broadly has also documented paintings and inscriptions, showing that underground environments could become places where people left visible records of ritual actions and visits. These were not random holes where somebody happened to lose a bowl. People transformed parts of the underground landscape into places of repeated religious activity. It also helps to remember that people approaching these sites would often already know stories about them. A landscape is experienced differently when it comes with a narrative. A child growing up near a cave may learn who is associated with it, what happened there, what should not be done there, and how people are expected to behave nearby. By adulthood, the cave is not simply a physical object waiting for interpretation. It already has a history. The same is true everywhere. A building where an important event occurred does not feel like an ordinary building to people who know the story. A battlefield is not merely a field. A grave is not simply a patch of soil. Places collect meanings, and those meanings influence how later generations experience them. For Maya communities, those meanings could reach far beyond individual memory. The underworld appeared in stories about gods, death, creation, ancestors, and heroic figures. In the Quiche Popol Vuh, the hero twins' descent to Xibalba is part of a larger sequence involving earlier generations. Ball games, sacrifice, deception, death, resurrection, and eventual triumph over the lords of death. Xibalba is dangerous precisely because it has inhabitants with intentions of their own. The hero twins do not wander through an empty cave system. They enter a social and supernatural realm where beings speak, challenge, trick, punish, and negotiate. This gives the world below a strangely familiar quality. It is frightening, but it has rules. It has personalities. It has politics of a sort, although they are probably not rulers you would choose to invite to dinner. When those stories are considered alongside archaeology, a fascinating picture begins to form. On one side, we have narratives describing descent into a dangerous supernatural realm. On the other, we have actual caves and cenotes containing evidence of ceremonies, offerings, burials, and repeated human activity. We should not force the two forms of evidence into a perfect match, because the stories we possess come from particular Maya traditions and periods, while archaeological sites can be much older and belonged to different communities. Yet both show that movement below the surface carried meanings that were much deeper than ordinary exploration. The geography beneath the Yucatan makes the relationship even more understandable. Modern divers and researchers have revealed vast networks of flooded caves running through the peninsula's limestone. Cenotes are surface entrances into an enormous aquifer, and some connect to extensive underwater systems. What appears above ground as a collection of separate pools can therefore be part of a much larger hidden environment beneath the surface. To modern explorers equipped with detailed maps, scuba gear, guidelines, lights, and scientific instruments, these systems are difficult enough to comprehend. To people who could see only individual entrances and accessible dry passages, the underground world must have seemed almost impossible to measure. You might enter one opening and have no idea how far the passage continued. A pool might seem to have no visible outlet even though water moved through channels far below. Two distant cenotes might appear completely separate while actually connecting to the same underground system. The landscape was giving ancient observers true evidence that an extensive hidden world existed beneath them. They did not have the scientific explanation we use now, but the observation itself was correct. Below the Maya world was another environment, one that could be entered in places but could never be seen in its entirety. That is why the question at the centre of this story is more interesting than simply asking whether the Maya were right about an underworld. In one important sense, there absolutely was a hidden world beneath their feet. There still is. It consists of limestone cavities, dry chambers, submerged passages, groundwater, cenotes, and immense cave systems rather than palaces filled with supernatural rulers. The Maya interpretation of that environment belonged to a religious and cosmological framework, but it was built around places people could physically visit. Stories and geology met at the same openings. Once you begin thinking about the Maya landscape in that way, the famous cities above ground start to look slightly different. We usually picture Maya civilization by looking upward at temples, pyramids, carved monuments, and buildings rising above plazas. Those are the remains that dominate photographs and documentaries because they are large, visible, and considerably easier to film than a submerged tunnel. Yet a complete Maya landscape also extended downward. Beneath settlements and forests lay another geography containing water, caves, darkness, ritual places, and connections with supernatural ideas. What happened above ground and what was believed to happen below it belonged to the same larger understanding of the universe. And before we follow the hero twins down the roads towards Xibalba, or examine what archaeologists have recovered from caves and cenotes, we need to understand that larger structure. The underworld was not an isolated religious invention added underneath an otherwise ordinary map. It belonged to a cosmos in which the sky, the human world, the earth, water, caves, gods, ancestors, rulers, and natural forces could all be connected. Once that arrangement becomes clearer, the decision to carry an offering deep into a cave begins to make much more sense, and so does the possibility that an opening in the ground could be treated not as the edge of the known world, but as an accessible route into another part of it. To understand why a cave or cenote could matter so much to the Maya, we first have to forget the modern habit of imagining the universe as a collection of separate categories. We tend to put astronomy in one box, religion in another, geography in another, politics somewhere else, and plumbing in a particularly practical corner where nobody expects to encounter a god. Ancient Maya ideas did not always divide the world so neatly. The sky, the earth, water, mountains, caves, ancestors, rulers, gods, crops, buildings, and directions could all participate in the same ordered system. Scholars studying Maya texts, art, architecture, archaeology, and later traditions have described a cosmos that was both layered vertically and organized horizontally, with the human world situated within a larger arrangement of places and powers. The exact details varied between Maya communities and across time, so there was never a single diagram that every Maya person would have recognized without argument, but a broad pattern appears again and again. A celestial region above, the inhabited world in the middle, and a realm below, while the surface itself was arranged around directions and a meaningful centre. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that ideas of layering, division into 4 directions, and the establishment of a centre were important ways of expressing cosmic order. That may sound complicated at first, but the basic idea is easier to picture if we begin with ordinary human experience. Wherever you are sitting right now, there is something above you, something around you, and something below you. Ancient Maya people looked upward and saw the movements of the sun, moon, planets, stars, clouds, storms, and birds. They looked outward and saw forests, settlements, cultivated fields, rivers in some regions, hills and mountains in others, animals, roads, neighbouring communities, and distant cities. They looked downward and found soil, graves, roots, caves, water, and openings that sometimes continued farther than anyone could safely explore. These were not imaginary observations. The cosmological ideas were built into a landscape people interacted with every day. What changed was the meaning assigned to those different regions. The sky was not simply empty air above the ground. The earth was not merely a platform on which houses happened to stand. The underground was not simply unused geological space. Each could be associated with different beings, events, materials, and forms of ritual activity, while connections between them mattered just as much as the regions themselves. The human world occupied an especially interesting position because it was not completely separate from either what lay above or what lay below. People could observe the sky and organize ceremonies around celestial events. They could raise temples toward the heavens, bury offerings beneath buildings, enter caves, draw water from cenotes, bury the dead, burn incense whose smoke rose upward, and place objects into openings in the earth. Movement therefore worked in more than one direction. Humans did not simply sit in the middle while gods remained politely in their assigned departments. Ritual offered ways of communicating across parts of the cosmos. Caves and pools could function as portals associated with gods and ancestors, while ceremonies performed there could seek rain or agricultural success. Research at places such as Carablanca in Belize has shown how openings in the earth and deep pools could become pilgrimage destinations precisely because people understood the landscape as sacred and capable of connecting them with forces beyond the ordinary human setting. There was also a strong horizontal structure to Maya ideas about space. The 4 cardinal directions were important, but the centre was important too. A common pattern found in Maya art and objects is the arrangement of 4 points around a 5th central point, something archaeologists and art historians often describe using the term quincunx. The centre was not simply a convenient place to put something, because symmetry looks nice, although Maya artists certainly appreciated good design. It could represent a point of connection and transition. Museum interpretations of Maya objects supported by iconography and archaeological context describe a 4-sided cosmolo organised toward the cardinal directions, with a 5th position at the centre. That centre could be represented by a great tree whose roots extended downward and whose branches reached upward, joining regions that otherwise appeared separate. The idea of a world tree is one of the most recognisable features of Maya cosmology, though it needs the same caution we applied to Xibalba. It would be too simple to imagine that every Maya community pictured precisely the same enormous tree in precisely the same way. Maya imagery contains different forms of world trees and tree-like cosmic structures, and later Maya traditions provide additional names and associations. The sabre is often connected with this idea, particularly in colonial and later traditions, and ancient imagery can show cosmic trees linking realms or marking important directional positions. At the centre, the tree could function as an axis connecting the world below, the human surface, and the sky. In some imagery, this central structure can also overlap with maize symbolism. which makes sense in a society where maize was not merely something eaten with dinner, but a basic agricultural foundation of life, identity, ritual, and myth. The Metropolitan Museum's interpretation of ancient Maya imagery describes the central axis as a great tree extending from the underworld into the heavens, while depictions connected with the maize god show that a maize stalk itself could express the idea of the world's centre. For someone accustomed to modern maps, the easiest mistake is to treat this as though the Maya were trying to create an early scientific diagram of the universe. Imagine a neat school textbook with sky written at the top, earth in the middle, underworld at the bottom, and a helpful tree running through all three. That is useful for about 30 seconds, and then it begins causing trouble. Maya cosmology was expressed through stories, ceremonies, buildings, images, burials, objects, landscapes, directions, political performance, and many local traditions. It did not need to function like a modern engineering drawing. A temple might express one aspect of cosmic structure. A cave ritual might express another. An image painted on a vessel could refer to mythological events. A household offering placed beneath a floor could establish a relationship with ancestors or sacred space. Different expressions could overlap without requiring everyone to stop and produce an official cosmological blueprint. This becomes especially clear when we look at Maya architecture, because ancient builders sometimes turned cosmic ideas into places people could physically enter and move around. Pyramids and temples were not simply tall buildings chosen because rulers enjoyed making visitors climb stairs. Although climbing one in tropical heat can certainly make political authority memorable, mountains held religious importance in Mesoamerican thought, and Maya architecture could deliberately evoke sacred mountains. The facades of some buildings incorporated imagery associated with a witz, a supernatural mountain, including large faces and open jaws that could resemble cave entrances. Temple 22 at Copan is one well-studied example. Research into its sculpture and architectural program argues that the building expressed not merely the idea of a mountain, but a wider model of the Maya universe, using architecture and imagery to communicate cosmic and royal order. Another scholarly analysis of Maya architecture describes vertical arrangements, in which underworld, earthly, and celestial imagery could be distributed through different levels of a structure. That means a ruler standing on or inside such architecture was doing more than occupying an expensive piece of real estate. Maya kingship was closely connected with religious performance, ancestry, and supernatural authority. Rulers presented themselves as people capable of maintaining relationships with divine and ancestral powers, and architecture could help make those claims visible. A temple represented as a sacred mountain created a setting in which the ruler could appear at a point of contact between different realms. The effect would have been both religious and political, which is a combination governments have found useful in many parts of the world. The Maya version, however, was expressed through a distinctive visual language of mountains, caves, celestial beings, ancestors, trees, serpents, gods, and royal bodies. At Holmol in Guatemala, for example, a monumental Maya frieze combines rulers, mountain spirits, feathered serpents, and underworld deities in imagery connected with the rebirth and veneration of royal ancestors. The building itself was not merely shelter for the image. Architecture, ancestry, supernatural geography, and political authority formed part of the same message. The relationship between buildings and the underground could also operate beneath the floor. Archaeologists working at Maya sites regularly encounter caches and dedicatory deposits intentionally placed beneath plazas, buildings, stairways, and other architectural features. Their contents differ widely, and scholars are careful not to assign the same meaning to every buried collection of objects. Even so, some ritual deposits appear to have helped establish sacred places and links between the visible world and what lay beneath it. Research on Maya caches has argued that certain deposits could create ritual pathways connecting the external world with the underworld, while dedicatory offerings could sanctify structures and connect them with ancestors. In other words, The meaningful underground was not restricted to enormous natural caves. People could create or emphasize relationships with the world below directly underneath places where they lived and performed ceremonies. This is useful because it prevents us from imagining Maya cosmology as something encountered only during rare expeditions into spectacular caverns. Cosmic order could be expressed at several scales: the shape of a city, the arrangement of structures around a plaza, the orientation of an altar, a burial under a house, a cache beneath a building, the symbolism of a ruler's ornaments, and the location of a cave could all connect ordinary human space with a larger scheme. Scholars have specifically noted that Maya concepts of cosmic order could be reproduced from the scale of the heavens down to built spaces and ritual objects. The repeated acts of dividing space into directions, establishing centres, and creating layers made the abstract arrangement physically present. It also means that the word underworld can mislead us if we automatically translate it into the Christian idea of hell. The Maya world below was certainly associated with death and dangerous beings, and stories such as the Popol Vuh can make it sound like a place where sensible travellers should read the reviews before booking accommodation. Yet the broader underground realm was not simply a prison for wicked souls. Caves were connected with water, rain, fertility, maize, ancestors, and supernatural beings associated with the earth. Archaeological scholarship on Maya cave use specifically emphasises this combination. Caves could serve as entrances to the underworld, while also being associated with earth deities, agricultural fertility, rainmaking, maize, and ancestors. That combination is important because it explains something that otherwise looks contradictory. Why would a place connected with death also be associated with life-giving water and crops? To the Maya, those ideas did not need to be opposites. Agriculture itself gives an obvious example. A seed is placed into the earth and disappears. For a period of time, it is hidden below the surface. Later, a living plant emerges. Maize is harvested, dried, stored, planted, and grows again. Maya imagery surrounding the maize god uses exactly this kind of relationship between death and renewal, including associations between a dried kernel, burial in the earth, and renewed plant life. What goes below can return transformed, so the underground can be associated with death without becoming a place concerned only with endings. The same logic appears in water. Rain comes from above, enters the ground, and can appear again through caves, springs, or cenotes. In many Maya regions, especially where limestone dominates the geology, the earth literally stores water. The ground therefore behaves less like a sealed floor and more like a system through which essential substances move. Caves and underground pools become obvious places for rituals concerned with rain because they are physically connected with water even before religious meaning is added. At Carablanca, researchers argue that Maya visitors approached pools understood as entrances to a watery underworld and used ritual activity to petition supernatural powers for rain and crops. Evidence suggests that visits intensified during severe droughts in the later Classic period. For those communities, a drought was not simply a meteorological statistic. It threatened maize, water supplies, household survival, political stability, and relationships with the powers believed to influence the environment. The sky above therefore had a relationship with the earth below. Rain did not belong exclusively to one region of the cosmos. Water moved between them. The same was true of the sun in Maya mythic and iconographic thought. From the perspective of someone watching the horizon, the sun rises in the east, crosses the sky, disappears in the west, and then somehow returns to the eastern horizon by the next morning. Different Maya traditions developed complex ideas around solar movement, night, death, and renewal, and underworld imagery could become part of explaining the transition from daylight to darkness and back again. We should resist turning all of Maya religion into a single solar diagram, but the observable cycle of disappearance and return fit naturally into a worldview in which movement between cosmic regions was possible. Death created another connection. The dead did not simply vanish from Maya social life the instant a burial was closed. ancestors could remain important to families, dynasties, and political communities. Royal monuments and architecture could preserve genealogies and relationships with deceased rulers, while household burials placed the dead quite literally within spaces occupied by later generations. The underground therefore contained not only unknown supernatural beings, but, in a very immediate sense, previous human beings. A family living above the burial of an ancestor was occupying a landscape in which the past existed directly beneath the present. This does not mean every burial was imagined as a doorway to the same underworld described in myth, but it does show how easily ancestry, death, physical depth, and sacred place could become connected. There is another detail that makes Maya spatial thinking particularly interesting. Centers could be created. The center of the universe did not have to mean one single GPS coordinate that everyone in Mesoamerica was expected to agree upon. Houses, plazas, cities, rulers, ritual spaces, and objects could reproduce cosmic ordering on smaller scales. A royal person wearing ornaments arranged around 4 directions and a center could symbolically occupy that central position. A settlement could be organized around meaningful axes. A ceremonial space could reproduce a model of cosmic order. This kind of repetition allowed Maya communities to bring the structure of the larger cosmos into local places. The world's center was therefore not necessarily somewhere unimaginably distant. Under particular ritual circumstances, the place where you stood could become a center. That sounds unusual, until we notice that modern people do something vaguely comparable, although usually with less jade and fewer supernatural birds. A national capital can be called the center of political life, even though it is obviously not located at the geometric center of the planet. A family home can be the center of someone's personal world. A religious building can reproduce ideas believed to apply far beyond its walls. Symbols can make a local place stand for something much larger. Maya cosmology took this relationship between local space and cosmic structure much further, embedding it in architecture, ritual deposits, directions, sacred landscapes, and royal performance. The natural environment helped reinforce the system, because some features already seemed to connect different levels of the world. A high mountain reaches toward the sky. A cave penetrates the earth. A tree extends branches upward while sending roots downward. A cenote opens at the surface but reveals water below. A tall temple creates elevation where the natural landscape may be relatively flat. A burial places a human body under the living community. These features do not require complicated explanation to make their vertical associations understandable. Maya religion gave those associations specific cultural meanings, but the starting points were things people could see, enter, climb, plant, bury, and touch. Caves were especially powerful because they combined several of these qualities at once. They were openings in the earth, they could contain water, their deepest areas were removed from sunlight, and entering them created a physical descent from the ordinary surface environment. Archaeological work shows that cave rituals occurred across long spans of Maya history, from the pre-classic through later periods, although practices changed over time and differed from site to site. Some caves contain evidence of offerings, burning, burials, and repeated ceremonial visits. Others were used in less dramatic ways. The important point is that subterranean spaces were a lasting part of Maya sacred geography, rather than a strange late invention. The boundary between natural and built environments could become equally flexible. Where suitable natural caves existed, communities could incorporate them into sacred landscapes and political territories. Where large caves were absent, even small cavities might acquire importance, and scholars have argued that Maya rulers sometimes incorporated cave symbolism or artificial cave-like spaces into centers of authority. Research at Max Nar in Belize, for instance, suggests that relatively small caves could still help establish sacred geography and political legitimacy. The size of an opening was therefore not the only thing that mattered. Meaning came from its position within a larger network of beliefs, histories, rituals, and relationships. This brings us back to the most important difference between the Maya cosmos and the simple picture we might draw for ourselves. Above, around, and below were not sealed compartments. They were connected zones, and certain places made those connections easier to express. A world tree could link underworld, surface, and sky. A sacred mountain could rise from human space towards celestial powers while containing a symbolic cave opening below. A cenote could connect the surface to groundwater and, through ritual interpretation, to gods and ancestors. A ruler could stand at a ceremonial centre and present himself as a mediator. An offering could move downward beneath a plaza while incense smoke moved upward into the air. The physical actions were real, and their religious significance depended on the idea that the cosmos permitted relationships across boundaries. Once that arrangement is understood, the Maya underworld stops looking like a separate fantasy, attached underneath an otherwise ordinary civilization. It was one region within a much larger system, and the routes leading toward it were already present in the landscape. The important question now becomes what the Maya believed might be encountered after crossing that boundary, because the world below was not always represented as quiet, empty, or welcoming. In one of the most famous surviving Maya narratives, the road downward leads towards Xibalba, where travellers face rulers associated with death, disease, deception, sacrifice, and a collection of tests designed with the unmistakable attitude of hosts who would very much prefer their guests not to leave. If the Maya cosmos included routes connecting the human world with what lay below it, then the next question is fairly obvious. What did people believe might be waiting at the other end? One of the most detailed surviving answers comes from the Popol Vuh, or Popol Vuh, a Quiche Maya narrative recorded in the 16th century by members of royal Quiche lineages in the Guatemalan highlands. The text preserves stories of creation, divine beings, heroic figures, ancestral history, and the origins of Quiche communities, and among its most famous episodes is an extended confrontation with a place called Xibalba. We have to keep the cultural distinction clear because Xibalba belongs specifically to this Quiche tradition, and should not simply be treated as the identical underworld belief of every Maya community across 2,000 years of history. Even with that caution, the story is extremely valuable, because it shows how one Maya tradition imagined the world below not as an empty darkness, but as an organised realm inhabited by rulers who possessed names, personalities, servants, roads, houses, gardens, a bull court, and a remarkably unpleasant approach to hospitality. Xibalba is often translated or described as the underworld, and that can immediately create the wrong picture for a modern audience. It was not simply the Maya equivalent of the Christian hell, with one evil ruler punishing bad people forever. In the Popol Vuh, Xibalba behaves more like a dangerous supernatural kingdom, associated with death, disease, suffering, sacrifice, and deception. Its rulers have authority, conduct meetings, issue invitations, send messengers, organise contests, maintain gardens, and apparently have enough administrative structure to make death feel almost bureaucratic. Their victims do not arrive because a moral judgment has been passed on their lives. The story instead presents Xibalba as a place whose rulers possess dangerous powers and can reach into the world of the living. That distinction matters because it tells us we are dealing with a different set of ideas about death and supernatural geography than the simple reward and punishment model many listeners may already know. At the top of this unpleasant hierarchy are two principal rulers, commonly translated as 1 death and 7 death. Beneath them are other lords of Xibalba associated with particular forms of sickness, injury, bodily decay, and human suffering. Depending on the translation, their English names vary, but the pattern is clear. Certain pairs are linked with blood and disease, others with pus and jaundice, others with bones and skulls, and still others with sudden forms of injury or death. The effect is less like meeting one general god of death, and more like discovering that the underworld has assembled an entire specialist department for everything that can go wrong with the human body. One might reasonably hope that such specialization would improve the quality of service. Unfortunately, the Popol Vuh suggests otherwise. The personalities of these rulers are just as important as the things they represent. They are not portrayed as calm guardians performing an unavoidable cosmic duty. They enjoy humiliating their visitors. They set traps, laugh when people fall for them, hide their identities, manipulate games, and design trials that are intended to be impossible. This makes Xibalba dangerous for a reason beyond its association with death. The realm is controlled by beings who cannot be trusted. A traveller has to pay attention not only to physical threats but to words, appearances, rules, and tricks. Knowing what something is becomes a matter of survival. A bench may not really be a safe place to sit. A ball used in a game may contain a hidden weapon. A polite invitation may actually be a plan to kill you. Even a group of impressive figures seated like rulers can turn out to include wooden decoys placed there specifically to make a visitor look foolish. That obsession with deception begins before a visitor has properly entered the court. In the Popol Vuh, the road to Xibalba contains obstacles and choices that test whether travellers understand where they're going. In the first journey described in the story, the earlier pair of brothers, 1 Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu, descend after receiving a summons from the Lords of Death. They must travel downward, cross dangerous rivers, and arrive at a crossroads where different coloured roads present choices. They take the road associated with Xibalba and eventually reach the rulers, but almost everything about their arrival is designed to make them fail. The underworld is therefore not presented as a place where you simply walk through a doorway and find the dead sitting quietly on the other side. Getting there is part of the danger, and the ability to recognise the correct path is part of the test. This is one reason the story becomes particularly interesting when considered alongside actual Maya caves. We should not claim that every physical cave was imagined as containing the precise roads and rulers described in the Popol Vuh, but the experience of travelling underground provides an obvious physical setting for stories about difficult routes into another realm. In a cave, paths really do divide. Some descend while others rise. One passage can narrow unexpectedly. Another can end at water. Darkness limits what can be seen ahead, and a wrong turn can become serious very quickly. Anyone who has ever become confused trying to find the bathroom in an unfamiliar hotel can probably appreciate how much worse the problem becomes when the building is made of limestone, has no lights, and may contain supernatural death officials. The routes in the Popol Vuh make Xibalba feel geographically reachable. The travellers descend, encounter rivers, choose roads, and arrive somewhere. That concrete sense of movement matters. The underworld is not discussed only as a philosophical idea about what happens after death. Characters travel there while alive. Messages move between Xibalba and the upper world. The Lords of Death hear activity taking place above them. Their owl messengers travel upward to deliver summonses. A woman associated with Xibalba later escapes from the realm and reaches the world above. Information, bodies, messengers, and eventually the hero twins can cross the boundary in both directions. The border is dangerous, but it is not completely sealed. Once visitors arrive, Xibalba contains another feature that makes it surprisingly recognisable: a court. 1 Death and 7 Death are not wandering monsters waiting behind a rock. They occupy positions of authority among other named beings. They receive visitors formally and expect their identities to be acknowledged. The first pair of brothers fail almost immediately because they greet wooden figures instead of the real rulers. The trick sounds childish when summarised quickly, but within the story it establishes an important theme. A successful visitor must see through appearances. The lords possess power partly because they know more than their victims. They know the arrangement of the room, the traps, the rules, and the intended outcome. The visitor does not. Knowledge, therefore, becomes one of the main weapons in the struggle between Xibalba and those who enter it. The hot bench offered to the first brothers continues the same pattern. They're invited to sit, apparently as guests, only to discover that the surface is burning. The lords laugh at them. This is not a grand cosmic battle between armies. It is humiliation through staged mistakes. The rulers of Xibalba want their visitors to misunderstand things. Their court operates almost like a sequence of practical jokes, designed by people who have somehow been given authority over disease and death, which is probably one of the stronger arguments against allowing practical jokers into senior management. The humour in the Popol Vuh can be surprisingly sharp, but the consequences remain serious. Failing the games of Xibalba leads to sacrifice. The most revealing parts of the realm may be the special houses used as trials. Different translations give the names in slightly different forms, but the narrative includes places usually described as the House of Darkness, Razor House, Cold House, Jaguar House, Fire House, and Bat House. These are not ordinary bedrooms with unfortunate decorating choices. Each creates a controlled form of danger. Darkness must be endured without consuming the light the lords have provided. Blades threaten to cut the visitors. Extreme cold threatens them in another place. Jaguars wait in another. Fire becomes another trial. And the Bat House contains dangerous creatures capable of killing anyone who exposes himself at the wrong moment. When Hunahpu and Xibalba eventually undergo these tests, survival depends on understanding the challenge and finding a way around its intended result. These houses give Xibalba structure. The realm is not frightening simply because it is dark. It contains specific dangers that can be named and encountered one after another. This is a useful feature of storytelling, because it allows an audience to follow the heroes through a sequence of escalating problems, but it also tells us something about the way danger is imagined. Death has many forms. People can bleed, become sick, suffer cold, be attacked by animals, burn, or be cut. The named rulers and trial houses turn these experiences into residents and places within a supernatural landscape. Things that threaten human life above ground become organised features of the realm below. Ancient Maya art shows that death and underworld beings were important long before the surviving Quiché manuscript of the Popol Vuh was recorded. Classic period Maya ceramics include skeletal or death-associated deities, creatures linked with darkness, and supernatural beings identified by modern scholars with the underworld. One 6th or 7th century vessel at the Metropolitan Museum of Art shows a deity identified as the jaguar god of the underworld, while another Maya vessel contains a dancing death god accompanied by nocturnal creatures. These images should not be treated as portraits of one death, 7 death, and every other named figure in the much later Quiché story. Centuries separate these objects from the colonial period recording of the Popol Vuh, and Maya traditions changed over time. What the artwork does show is that underworld deities, death imagery, darkness, and supernatural inhabitants of the world below had a deep history in Maya visual culture. Another classic Maya bowl shows creatures combining features of centipedes, serpents, and birds within an underworld scene. Human or supernatural figures emerge from their mouths in imagery interpreted in terms of birth and renewal. That combination is important because once again, the Maya underworld is not exclusively about final destruction. Creatures associated with damp earth and decay can become connected with transformation and renewed life. The same region of the cosmos that contains death gods can participate in stories of emergence and rebirth. This is one reason simply calling Xibalba hell hides more than it explains. The world below can be deadly without representing a permanent cosmic rubbish bin for everything considered bad. The ball game also connects the realm of Xibalba with ideas larger than death alone. The Mesoamerican ball game was played across a huge region and over many centuries, with considerable variation in rules, equipment, and meaning. In Maya context, it could have political, ceremonial, and mythological importance, and surviving imagery shows rulers participating in, or identifying themselves with supernatural ball games. Scholars have connected ball courts with entrances to the underworld, while the Popol Vuh places the contest between the heroic brothers and the lords of Xibalba directly within a ball game tradition. The story does not present the game as harmless recreation. It becomes a means through which powers belonging to different regions of the cosmos confront one another. The first confrontation begins because the older brothers are playing loudly enough to disturb the rulers below. 1 Death and 7 Death hear the noise and decide to summon them. This detail is easy to pass over because the later adventures are more dramatic, but it gives us a revealing picture of the relationship between worlds. The surface and underworld are close enough that activity in one can irritate inhabitants of the other. The lords respond by sending owl messengers, inviting the brothers to bring their ball game equipment to Xibalba. It sounds almost friendly. They would simply like to play. Unfortunately, anyone who has already spent a few pages with these rulers knows that an invitation from Xibalba should probably be read with the same caution, normally reserved for messages announcing that you have unexpectedly inherited a large fortune from a distant stranger. 1 Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu accept the invitation and descend. They make mistakes along the way and fail the test prepared for them. Eventually they are killed. Their bodies are buried near the ball court while the head of 1 Hunahpu is placed in the fork of a calabash tree. Here the story changes direction in a way that demonstrates why death in the Popol Vuh is rarely as simple as it first appears. The tree produces fruit, and the severed head becomes difficult to distinguish among the calabashes. A young woman from Xibalba, commonly translated as Blood Woman or Blood Moon depending on the edition, hears about the forbidden tree and approaches it. 1 Hunahpu's head speaks to her and causes her to become pregnant through saliva placed in her hand. She later escapes Xibalba and gives birth to Hunahpu and Xibalba, the hero twins. The sequence contains death, decapitation, a tree-producing fruit, conception, escape from the underworld, and the birth of a new generation. A body is destroyed, but the story continues through descendants. This is exactly the kind of combination that makes Maya underworld traditions difficult to reduce to a simple place of punishment. Death creates the conditions for another stage of life. The lords believe they have eliminated their opponents, but their actions eventually produce the very figures who will defeat them. The rulers of death are powerful, yet they cannot control what follows death as completely as they imagine. Blood Woman's escape also tells us more about Xibalba as a functioning realm. She has family there. Her father belongs to its society, and the lords have enough authority to order her sacrifice when her pregnancy becomes known. Owl messengers are again involved, but rather than killing her, they are persuaded to substitute tree sap for her heart. The deception works, and she leaves the underworld for the home of the older brother's mother. Once again, the border between Xibalba and the upper world can be crossed. The realm below has inhabitants who can leave it, at least under extraordinary circumstances, and objects or substances can substitute for bodies within its ritual logic. By the time Hunahpu and Xibalba grow old enough to attract the attention of Xibalba, the audience already knows exactly what happened to the previous generation. That gives their eventual summons a very different feeling. The road is the same dangerous road. The rulers are still waiting. The tricks have not changed very much because 1 Death and 7 Death are apparently confident that a successful method does not require much revision. The hot bench is still available, the wooden figures are still part of the reception, the torch and cigars are still used as a test, and the lords still expect their visitors to misunderstand what's happening. What has changed is the quality of the visitors. The hero twins enter with information their father and uncle did not possess. They know they are being tested. Instead of accepting appearances, they investigate them. Instead of walking into each trap, they search for a way to satisfy the stated requirement without accepting the intended outcome. The most famous example comes when they need to identify the true lords among the false figures. The twins send a mosquito ahead to bite the seated inhabitants. As each real lord reacts and is addressed by name by the next, the mosquito effectively conducts a supernatural attendance check. By the time the twins arrive, they know whom they are looking at. The wooden figures receive no greeting, the real rulers are addressed correctly, and one of Xibalba's most successful tricks fails immediately. That difference between generations reveals perhaps the most important characteristic of Xibalba. It is frightening, but it is not unbeatable. Its rulers depend on fear, deception, hidden information, and predictable responses. Visitors who panic or misunderstand the rules are destroyed. Visitors who observe carefully can find weaknesses. The Lords of Death therefore represent enormous power without possessing perfect wisdom. They are capable of killing, but they can also be fooled. They enjoy spectacle so much that their own curiosity can be used against them. They are confident enough to underestimate their opponents. For all their association with death and disease, they display flaws that are very human. This may help explain why the hero-twin narrative has remained so compelling. It does not solve the problem of death by pretending death does not exist. The heroes enter the place where death is strongest. They encounter its rulers on their own ground, and accept that cleverness alone will not allow them to avoid every danger indefinitely. At one point Hunahpu is decapitated in Bat House. Later the twins deliberately enter a fire and die, knowing that their destruction is part of a larger plan. Their bones are ground and scattered into water, after which they return in transformed form. Eventually they use performances of death and revival to fascinate the Lords of Xibalba until the rulers themselves ask to participate. That final mistake becomes their defeat. It is worth stopping before following that entire sequence, because the nature of Xibalba is already much clearer. This is a realm with roads and crossroads, rivers and courts, rulers and servants, bull games and gardens, trial houses and places of sacrifice. It is associated with diseases and the destruction of bodies, but also with transformation and the possibility of emergence. It is connected with the world above closely enough for sound, messages, travellers, and supernatural consequences to move between them. Its rulers are terrifying because they possess genuine power, but they are not all-knowing. They can be defeated by people who understand their tricks better than they understand themselves. For Maya listeners familiar with caves, sinkholes, mountains, dark passages, and underground water, a story about descent into such a realm existed alongside a landscape in which downward journeys were physically possible. We cannot take the Popol Vuh and use it as a literal guidebook to every ritual cave in the Maya region, and we cannot assume that an ancient visitor entering a cenote expected to find one death sitting behind the next bend. The relationship is more careful than that. Archaeology shows that caves and underground places carry genuine religious significance across Maya societies, while the Quiche narrative shows one especially detailed way in which a Maya tradition could imagine a supernatural world below the human surface. Together they help us understand why darkness beneath the earth could be treated as a region with its own inhabitants, powers and rules rather than as empty space. The safest way to learn those rules, at least according to the Popol Vuh, would have been to watch what happened to someone else first, and Hunahpu and Xibalba have precisely that advantage. Their father and uncle have already taken the road into Xibalba and failed. The younger twins know that the same rulers are waiting for them. They know that an invitation to play ball is really a threat, and they understand that reaching the underworld is only the beginning of the problem. Their descent therefore becomes much more than a journey into a frightening place. It becomes a contest in which memory, observation, humour, deception, sacrifice, and intelligence are tested against the powers of death, beginning from the moment the brothers leave the familiar world and take the road downward. Hunahpu and Xibalba do not begin their journey into Xibalba as two heroes wandering into an unknown place with nothing but courage and good intentions. They have something much more useful, a family history of exactly how badly things can go there. Their father, one Hunahpu, and their uncle, 7 Hunahpu, had already been summoned by the Lords of Xibalba after the sound of their bull game disturbed the rulers below. The older brothers followed the road downward, crossed the dangerous rivers, entered the court, fell for the tricks prepared for them, failed the test involving a torch and cigars, and were killed. One Hunahpu's severed head was later placed in a calabash tree, where it became involved in the unusual conception of the next generation. Blood Woman approached the tree, received saliva from the skull into her hand, became pregnant, escaped Xibalba, and eventually gave birth to Hunahpu and Xibalba. By the time the younger twins grow into skilled ball players themselves, the Lords of Death have already destroyed one generation of their family. The story therefore sends the twins toward the same place where their father and uncle failed, but it gives them one decisive advantage. They know that Xibalba cheats. This difference becomes clear long before the twins reach the underworld court. Hunahpu and Xibalba discover the ball game equipment that belonged to the earlier brothers and begin playing. Once again the sound reaches Xibalba. 1 death, 7 death, and the other rulers hear the game and send their messengers upward with another invitation. The pattern is deliberately familiar. The lords expect the younger pair to follow the same route and make the same mistakes, because from their point of view, the previous strategy worked perfectly well. The grandmother of Hunahpu and Xibalba understands the danger immediately. She has already lost her sons to the underworld, and now her grandsons have received the same summons. The twins, however, do not refuse. They set out for Xibalba knowing that the invitation is not an invitation in any ordinary sense. Nobody receiving a request from the Lords of Death should assume there will be refreshments and a reasonable return time. The road downward brings them to the same dangerous landscape their father and uncle encountered, including rivers and the crossroads that separate the routes leading towards Xibalba. Yet the younger twins behave differently. They do not simply move forward and hope for the best. They examine the problem before committing themselves. In one retelling based on the Popol Vuh, they use their blowguns to help cross the dangerous rivers rather than entering them directly, and when they reach the place where the roads divide, they understand that choosing correctly requires information. Their entire approach is based on the idea that Xibalba's greatest advantage is not superior strength, but superior knowledge. The lords know where every trap is because they built the traps. The twins therefore begin taking that advantage away from them. The best example comes before they formally greet the rulers. Hunahpu takes a hair from his leg and transforms it into a mosquito, sending the insect to head into the court. The mosquito bites the seated figures one after another. The first figures do not react because they are wooden images rather than actual lords of Xibalba. Once the mosquito reaches the real rulers, however, they respond to the bites, and their companions address them by name. In this way, the twins learn who is real and who is not before entering the room. It is a remarkably practical solution to a supernatural problem. The older brothers had embarrassed themselves by greeting wooden figures as rulers because they could not tell the difference. Hunahpu and Xibalba effectively send in a very small reconnaissance agent and allow the lords to identify themselves through annoyance. When the twins finally enter, they ignore the wooden figures and greet the real rulers correctly. The first trap fails. The lords then offer them the same heated bench that had fooled the previous visitors. Hunahpu and Xibalba recognize what it is and refuse to sit on it. Another trap fails. The twins are then taken to the House of Darkness and given a burning torch and lit cigars. They are told that the objects must be returned the next morning in exactly the condition in which they were received. This is designed to be impossible. If the twins use the torch and cigars through the night, they will be consumed. If they extinguish them, they will be left in complete darkness. The older brothers failed this test. Hunahpu and Xibalba find a third option. They create the appearance of burning light without actually consuming the objects, using bright materials and insects to imitate the glow. The lords receive the torch and cigars back intact in the morning and realize that these guests are going to be considerably more difficult to kill. The confrontation now moves to the bull court, which is especially important because the bull game caused the conflict in the first place. The lords insist on using their own bull, but their equipment contains another hidden danger. A blade has been concealed inside it. Hunahpu and Xibalba expose the trick and object, making it clear that they will not simply continue playing while their opponents turn sporting equipment into concealed weapons. The Lords agree to use a normal rubber ball instead. What follows is not simply a contest of athletic skill. The ball game is another negotiation in which each side tries to control the conditions. The twins even allow themselves to lose at one point, after which the Lords demand flowers as their prize. This sounds harmless until we learn that the flowers must come from the Lord's own guarded garden. The challenge is therefore another trap. The twins are expected to obtain something from a place they are not supposed to enter. Instead of attempting the theft themselves, they recruit ants to cut the flowers for them. The insects move into the garden while the birds assigned to guard it fail to prevent the raid. By morning, the twins have exactly what the Lords requested. The pattern is becoming difficult for Xibalba to ignore. Every challenge is designed with one expected response in mind, and the twins repeatedly choose something else. They survive not because they are physically invulnerable, but because they understand that rules can be interpreted, appearances can be manipulated, animals can become helpers, and a problem rarely has to be solved in the way the person setting the problem expects. That makes them unusually dangerous opponents for rulers whose power depends heavily on visitors behaving predictably. The trials become more physical as the twins are sent through the special houses of Xibalba. Razor houses filled with cutting blades intended to slice them apart. The twins speak to the blades and persuade them not to attack. They then use their time inside the house to arrange the collection of the flowers demanded by the Lords. In Cold House, they survive the freezing conditions rather than allowing themselves to be overcome. In Jaguar House, they face dangerous animals and distract them with bones. In Firehouse, they endure the flames without being destroyed. The details differ somewhat among translations and retellings, but the repeated structure remains unmistakable. The Lords create an environment in which death seems inevitable, while the twins find a way to change the conditions of the test. Bat House finally produces a genuine disaster. Hunahpu and Xibalba shelter inside their blowguns while dangerous bats move around them in the darkness. They wait for morning, but Hunahpu eventually tries to see whether daylight has arrived. At that moment, a bat called Camazots cuts off his head. The head is taken and placed at the ball court, where the Lords intend to use it in the next game. For the first time since the younger twins entered Xibalba, one of the traps appears to have worked completely. Hunahpu has been decapitated, Xibalba is left without his brother, and the Lords now possess the head of one of their opponents. It repeats what happened to the previous generation closely enough to make the situation even worse. One Hunahpu lost his head in Xibalba, and now his son has done the same. Xibalba does not abandon the contest. He calls animals together and asks them to bring different kinds of food. A squash is eventually used to create a temporary replacement for Hunahpu's head with supernatural assistance. A rabbit is then positioned near the ball court as part of a plan to recover the real one. When the match begins, the Lords use Hunahpu's head as the ball, apparently convinced that they have already won. During play, the head is directed away from the court and the rabbit runs off, causing the Lords to chase it because they mistake the moving animal for the ball. While they are distracted, the twins recover Hunahpu's real head and restore it to his body. The squash substitute is placed where the Lords expect the ball to be. When play resumes, it eventually breaks open and scatters its seeds, exposing the deception. Once again, the rulers of Xibalba discover that victory announced too early can become embarrassing. By this stage, it would be easy to assume that the goal of the hero twins is simply to survive every test until the Lords run out of ideas. That is not what happens. Hunahpu and Xibalba understand that escaping death is not enough to defeat the rulers of death. They eventually learn how the Lords intend to kill them and prepare for it. When Xibalba creates another deadly challenge involving a great heated oven or fire, the twins do something the rulers do not expect. Rather than desperately trying to avoid the trap, they enter it willingly. They die. This is the turning point of the entire journey, because it completely changes the relationship between the heroes and Xibalba. Until now, The lords have repeatedly attempted to impose death on the twins and failed. Now the twins accept death as part of their own strategy. The lords are delighted. From their point of view, the irritating visitors who survived every trick have finally been eliminated. They order the bodies burned and the bones ground down. The remains are then scattered into water. What the lords do not understand is that this is exactly what the twins expected. After a period of time, Hunahpu and Xibalba return. The narrative describes them first appearing in connection with fish before taking human form again, and they come back disguised as poor wandering performers, rather than immediately announcing that the people Xibalba just killed have returned for another appointment. The lords believe the twins are gone and have no reason to connect these entertainers with their former opponents. The disguise gives Hunahpu and Xibalba access to something even more useful than survival: the curiosity of their enemies. Stories spread about performers who can carry out extraordinary tricks. They can burn a house and restore it. They can kill an animal and bring it back to life. Most importantly, they can sacrifice one another and then return the dead performer to life. These demonstrations eventually reach the attention of the rulers of Xibalba, who summon the entertainers to perform before them. Hunahpu and Xibalba pretend to be reluctant and humble, behaving as though they are uncomfortable in the presence of such important lords. The deception works because it gives the rulers exactly the impression they want to have of themselves. Xibalba's leaders are accustomed to visitors being intimidated, and two nervous performers seem much more believable to them than two enemies who have returned from death. The twins begin demonstrating their abilities. A dog is killed and restored. Other astonishing performances follow. Then one twin sacrifices the other and brings him back to life. The rulers are fascinated rather than alarmed. This is the moment when one of their greatest weaknesses finally becomes fatal. They enjoy spectacle, and they are confident that they remain in control of it. 1. Death and 7. Death asks the performers to carry out the same act on them. It is an extraordinary request when you think about it. The rulers of a realm devoted to killing people voluntarily ask two complete strangers to sacrifice them, because they have just watched an entertaining demonstration. One might expect beings with so much professional experience in death to show slightly better risk assessment. Hunahpu and Xibalba accept. They sacrifice the leading lords of Xibalba, but this time there is no restoration. The dead rulers remain dead. The other inhabitants of the underworld understand immediately that something has changed. Hunahpu and Xibalba reveal who they really are and explain the reason for their actions, identifying themselves with the earlier brothers whom Xibalba destroyed. The underworld rulers have been defeated through the same mixture of death, performance, deception, and overconfidence that they had used against their own victims. The difference is that the twins understand both sides of the process. They know how to die and return, while the lords who thought they controlled death discover that they do not control resurrection. The surviving rulers beg for mercy. The twins do not erase Xibalba from existence, but they reduce its status and power. The Popol Vuh describes a loss of glory for the underworld rulers, whose former ability to receive grand offerings and exercise the same authority is diminished. The victory is therefore not presented as the complete disappearance of death. People will still die. Illness and danger remain part of the world. What has been defeated is the arrogant authority of the particular rulers who believed they could summon others, humiliate them, kill them, and remain beyond challenge themselves. That distinction makes the story much more interesting than a simple tale in which good heroes kill bad monsters. Hunahpu and Xibalba win because they learn. Their father and uncle entered without understanding the traps and died. The younger twins repeat the journey but carry knowledge of the earlier failure with them. They test appearances instead of trusting them, use animals and insects as allies, manipulate the rules of games, survive environments designed to kill them, and eventually recognize that their own deaths can be used strategically. Each stage depends upon transformation. A leg hair becomes a mosquito. Light is imitated without burning a torch. Ants become flower thieves. A squash becomes a head. A rabbit becomes a false ball. Dead bodies become living performers. Entertainment becomes a weapon. The story constantly asks whether something is really what it appears to be. This is particularly appropriate for a journey underground where vision itself becomes unreliable. In a cave, a small amount of light can make formations look completely different depending on the angle. A passage that appears shallow may descend sharply beyond the visible area. A still pool may hide an enormous submerged tunnel. Sounds can arrive from places that are difficult to locate. The Popol Vuh is not describing an archaeological expedition through a literal cave, but its underworld is filled with the same basic problem. Travellers cannot survive by trusting the first thing they see. They need information about what lies beyond the visible surface. The role of the ball game gives the story another connection with actual Maya religious life. Ball courts appear at Maya sites across different regions and periods, and ball game imagery occurs on monuments, ceramics, and other objects. The game could be linked with political ceremonies, elite identity, warfare, sacrifice, and myth, although its significance differed from place to place and should not be reduced to one single explanation. In the Popol Vuh, however, the ball game clearly becomes the means through which generations of heroes confront Xibalba. The earlier brothers are summoned because of their playing, while Hunahpu and Xbalanque eventually turn the game back against the rulers below. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indians summarizes the hero twin cycle as a central part of the Quiché creation narrative, in which the twins confront the lords of the underworld in a momentous ball game and defeat them after surviving their trials. The twins' journey also belongs to a larger creation story. According to the Smithsonian's presentation of the Quiché tradition, their defeat of the lords of the underworld helps prepare the world for the successful creation of human beings from maize. The hero twins eventually leave Xibalba, rise into the heavens, and become celestial bodies in this retelling, while the creation of humans from white and yellow corn follows within the larger narrative. This is why the journey cannot be separated entirely from themes of maize, death, regeneration, and the establishment of an ordered human world. Xibalba is not merely an unpleasant side trip undertaken by two adventurous brothers. What happens there belongs to the process through which the world becomes ready for human life. There is another reason the story matters for our subject. Hunahpu and Xbalanque do something that appears again and again in Maya relationships with the supernatural landscape. They travel toward dangerous powers rather than simply trying to remain as far away from them as possible. Xibalba is clearly threatening, yet the answer is not to seal its entrance and pretend it does not exist. The twins descend into it. They negotiate there, play there, suffer there, die there, return there, and eventually change the balance of power there. Contact with the world below is dangerous, but contact is possible. That idea helps us move from mythology back into archaeology. Maya people did not merely tell stories in which beings descended toward an underworld. At numerous sites, real people physically entered caves. They carried ceramic vessels, incense, food, valuable materials and other objects into darkness. They burned offerings, modified underground spaces, left human remains, and sometimes travelled surprisingly far from daylight to perform rituals. No archaeologist can stand beside an ancient person and ask exactly what they expected to encounter, and it would be reckless to label every cave as a direct entrance to the Xibalba of the Popol Vuh. Yet the physical behaviour is difficult to ignore. The world below was approached, not merely feared from a distance. The hero twins make that relationship easier to understand because their story shows that entering the underworld did not automatically mean joining the dead forever. A living being could cross the boundary. A messenger could cross it. A woman could leave Xibalba and give birth in the upper world. The twins could descend, die, return, disguise themselves, and eventually come back out. The border between worlds had consequences, but it could be crossed under exceptional circumstances. In a religious landscape where caves and openings in the earth already provided physical routes downward, stories like this gave supernatural geography, a form that was concrete enough to imagine as a journey. For someone approaching a sacred cave in the Maya world, the point was probably not to reenact every step taken by Hunahpu and Xibalba. Local traditions, particular gods, community needs, and the purpose of an individual ceremony could all differ. The Popol Vuh itself belongs to Quichua tradition in the Guatemalan highlands and was recorded long after many of the archaeological caves we'll discuss had been used. But the story preserves a powerful principle that appears much more widely in Maya religious thought. What lies beneath the earth can be active, inhabited, dangerous, and accessible, and human beings may have reasons to approach it despite the risk. That brings us back to the physical entrances themselves, because the Maya did not need to invent imaginary doors in order to picture movement below the surface. Across the landscape, caves opened into hills and limestone. Cenotes exposed groundwater beneath the earth. Underground passages carried water through places no person standing above could see. Some entrances were large and obvious, while others were narrow, concealed, or difficult to reach. These were the places where stories about descent met the actual terrain, and where ritual behaviour left behind objects that archaeologists can still recover. The next step downward therefore begins not with another supernatural road described in a story, but with real caves and cenotes where Maya people stood at the edge of darkness and chose to go inside. The road into the Maya underworld did not exist only in stories about Hunahpu and Xibalba. Across the Maya region, there were real places where a person could leave the bright surface world behind and descend into darkness, sometimes following dry passages through limestone and sometimes reaching pools whose water continued into submerged tunnels that no ancient visitor could have fully explored. Caves and cenotes were therefore unusual religious places, because very little imagination was required to understand them as entrances into another part of the world. You could stand at the opening, feel cooler air coming from below, watch daylight disappear along the walls, hear water somewhere farther inside, and then physically cross the boundary yourself. Archaeology shows that Maya people did exactly that for many centuries. They entered caves carrying pottery, incense burners, food, tools, valuable objects, and other materials, and they returned to some underground locations repeatedly for ritual activity, from the pre-classic period through the classic and into the post-classic. Caves were not one minor feature of Maya religion that appeared occasionally when somebody happened to find a convenient hole in the ground. In many areas, they formed an important part of the sacred landscape, and the evidence left inside them shows that the journey underground could have a purpose as deliberate as entering a temple or gathering in a ceremonial plaza. The physical landscape of the Yucatan Peninsula makes this relationship especially understandable. Much of the peninsula is made of limestone, a rock that can slowly dissolve when slightly acidic rainwater moves through cracks and fractures. Over very long periods, those small openings can become cavities, passages, chambers, and extensive cave systems. In many places, the water table lies inside this porous rock, so sections of the caves are flooded. When a cave roof weakens and collapses, the water below may become visible from the surface, forming the sinkholes known as cenotes. The modern word comes through Spanish from a Yucatec Maya term, usually rendered as zonot or tzonot. From above, one cenote may look like a circular pond surrounded by vegetation, while another resembles a deep vertical shaft, and another opens into a cavern with water beneath an overhanging roof. What appears to be a separate pool can also be part of a much larger underground hydrological system. Modern scientific work in systems such as Xibalba in Quintana Roo confirms that natural cave passages penetrate the coastal aquifer and carry fresh and saline water through a complex subterranean environment. Ancient Maya communities could not map these flooded systems in the way modern cave divers can, but they could clearly see that a large part of their water existed somewhere below the surface. That would have mattered even if the caves had possessed no religious meaning at all. Northern Yucatan has very few permanent surface rivers because water drains so readily into the limestone. Cenotes could therefore provide essential fresh water for settlements, and communities often developed around reliable sources. Everyday life might involve collecting water from an opening that also led into a dark space whose full extent was unknown. This is one of those situations in which geology seems almost determined to encourage cosmology. Rain arrives from above, disappears beneath the earth, gathers in hidden places, and can then be reached through openings descending into the ground. If the rains fail, the water below becomes even more important. If crops depend upon those rains, questions about who controls water become questions about survival. Maya traditions connected caves and cenotes with supernatural powers associated with water and rain, including Chak in Yucatec Maya contexts, and archaeological research suggests that some cave ritual activity increased during periods of severe drought. That does not mean every underground ceremony was a rain ritual, but it shows how naturally the physical water system could become connected with religious efforts to secure agricultural and environmental stability. It is also important not to imagine that every cenote was automatically sacred in exactly the same way. Archaeologists distinguish between evidence of ordinary domestic use and evidence suggesting ceremonial deposition. A community needs drinking water, washing water, and water for daily tasks, and people using a cenote for those purposes inevitably leave things behind. Pots break, construction material falls in, construction. Animal remains may enter naturally or through human activity. Somebody can drop something valuable into water without intending to send it to a god, a fact that remains painfully true around swimming pools today. Ritual interpretation becomes stronger when archaeologists find repeated patterns such as numerous human remains, unusually valuable materials, deliberately arranged objects, incense burners, special ceramic vessels, or deposits located where accidental loss is difficult to explain. Researchers studying Maya cenotes have emphasized that some appear to have served primarily domestic roles, while others contain clear evidence of offerings and sacrifice. The underground landscape was therefore differentiated. Some water sources were places of routine necessity, some were important ceremonial spaces, and some probably combined practical and sacred functions in ways that changed over time. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza is the most famous example of what could happen when one of these openings became a major ritual destination. Chichen Itza developed into an important Maya political and ceremonial center in northern Yucatan, and the large cenote north of the monumental center received offerings over many generations. 20th century investigations recovered human remains, along with an extraordinary collection of objects including jade, gold, copper, wood, textiles, ceramic vessels, copal resin, and other materials. Some objects came from far beyond the immediate region, including items connected with distant parts of Mesoamerica and Central America, which shows that the cenote participated in networks reaching well outside Chichen Itza itself. Hundreds of jade objects were deposited there, and jade was among the most highly valued materials in Maya elite culture. Other offerings included combinations of materials that almost never survive at ordinary archaeological sites, because wood, fibre, and other organic substances decay quickly in tropical environments. The waterlogged cenote preserved parts of a ritual world that would otherwise have disappeared. The scale of those deposits immediately changes how we should picture the place. This was not one nervous individual approaching the water, dropping in a bead and hoping nobody had noticed. Objects accumulated through repeated ceremonial activity over long periods. People came to the edge carrying things that represented labour, wealth, political connections, and religious value, and some of those things were deliberately surrendered to a place from which they were not expected to be retrieved. Throwing a jade ornament into deep water is meaningful precisely because jade does not become less valuable just because a ceremony has begun. Sacrifice involves giving something up. The greater the value of the object, the more clearly the act demonstrates that the purpose of the offering is more important than ordinary possession. At the sacred cenote, researchers have interpreted these deposits in connection with petitions for rain, agricultural fertility, and broader devotional practices. The cenote was therefore not valuable only because it contained water. Its depth and connection to the watery world below helped make it an appropriate place to send valuable things beyond the normal human environment. Human remains make this subject more uncomfortable, but they cannot be avoided if we want to understand what archaeology actually found. The sacred cenote contains the remains of people who were deposited there, and historical sources from the early colonial period also describe sacrificial practices at Chichen Itza in connection with drought and appeals to supernatural powers. Archaeologists have spent years examining skeletal evidence to understand who these individuals were and how they entered the cenote, and interpretations have changed as methods improved. We should be careful about turning every set of bones from a Maya cave or cenote into a dramatic scene of sacrifice, because people could also be buried in caves and accidental deaths were possible. Context, trauma, demographic patterns, associated objects, and the way remains are distributed all matter. Even with those cautions, there is no serious doubt that human sacrifice formed part of Maya ritual life in certain periods and settings, including some watery and underground locations. The fact that people could be offered into a cenote shows how literally the opening could function as a route of transfer. A person deposited there was removed from ordinary social space and placed into a location associated with powers beneath the surface. Caves provided a somewhat different experience because the ritual journey could continue horizontally and downward for considerable distances after the entrance disappeared from view. One of the most revealing examples near Chichen Itza is Balamkanshi, located roughly 6 kilometers east of the ancient city. Archaeological investigations show that the cave had been used ceremonially over a very long period, with pottery indicating activity from around 300 BCE into the post-classic, while the most intensive use appears to have taken place between roughly 900 and 1200 CE. The cave contains pottery, incense burners, miniature grinding stones, and other ritual objects. What makes the setting especially memorable is a natural column created where a stalactite and stalagmite joined. The formation resembles a tree, and modern archaeological interpretation at the site identifies it with the sacred Xibalba and the idea of an axis linking levels of the cosmos. The greatest concentration of offerings occurs in this part of the cave, including incense burners bearing representations of Chak, the rain deity. Farther inside, near the aquifer, additional offerings were deposited. Balamkanshi gives us an unusually clear example of how natural geology could become part of religious interpretation without anyone needing to construct the central feature. Water dripping through limestone over thousands of years produced the column. Maya visitors encountered it and treated the chamber around it as a significant ceremonial location. The cave already looked different from an ordinary human environment, and particular formations could become meaningful because they resembled things that were cosmologically important. A column connecting ceiling and floor could suggest the same vertical relationship expressed by the great tree-linking regions of the universe. The cave itself made that connection visible. Visitors standing near the formation were underground, close to water, surrounded by stone, and looking at something that appeared to connect the upper and lower surfaces of the chamber. Geological accident and religious interpretation occupied exactly the same place without competing with one another. The rediscovery of Balamkanshi's deeper ritual chambers also reminds us how easily underground spaces can remain hidden, even when people know a cave is there. The site was known in the 20th century, but in 1959 a local guide named José Humberto Gómez noticed that part of a chamber appeared artificial. Investigation revealed a masonry wall covered with stucco that had sealed access to additional sections of the cave. Removing the blockage exposed chambers containing ceremonial material that had remained largely undisturbed. The ancient closure is important because it demonstrates that people did not merely wander casually through the entire cave. Access could be controlled, passages could be sealed, and certain spaces could acquire a different status from areas near the entrance. The deeper one travels underground, the more effort is required to carry objects, maintain light, navigate difficult terrain, and return safely. When offerings appear at considerable distance from daylight, the difficulty of reaching the location becomes part of the archaeological evidence that the place itself mattered. That pattern appears beyond Yucatan as well. In the limestone landscapes of Belize, archaeological investigations have revealed extensive Maya ritual activity in caves. Sites contain ceramics, burials, stone monuments, modified surfaces, burned areas, and other evidence of repeated visits. At Acton, Tunishil, Muknal and other caves in west-central Belize, archaeological teams documented ceremonial activity taking place far inside underground environments. Research throughout the southern Maya lowlands has shown that caves were used from very early periods onward, and that their roles could shift as political and environmental conditions changed. Some appear to have been associated with community ritual, others with elite activity, water petitions, burial, sacrifice, or claims to political legitimacy. Even relatively small caves could matter. Studies at Max Ney and Belize argue that modest cavities could help establish sacred geography and support elite claims to territory and authority, which tells us that a cave did not need an entrance suitable for a documentary film crew to possess religious importance. Entering one of these places would have been a very different experience from standing beside an open cenote under daylight. Imagine beginning at a cave mouth, where forest sounds remain audible behind you. As you move inward, the light becomes weaker until your torch or lamp is the only useful source. Your eyes can see only a limited section of wall at a time. Stalactites descend from the ceiling, stalagmites rise from the floor, and irregular columns appear where the two have joined. Narrow sections require careful movement. Wider chambers make the darkness feel larger rather than smaller, because your light cannot reach the opposite side. Smoke from burning material can collect in enclosed spaces. Water reflects movement and makes shadows less reliable. The sound of speaking changes and footsteps echo from rock. None of these effects requires supernatural explanation, but all of them make a cave an unusually convincing place in which to perform a ceremony involving beings believed to inhabit a world separate from ordinary daylight. The practical difficulty of cave ritual also tells us something about the people performing it. Ceremonies could require planning. Light had to be maintained. Offerings had to be carried without breaking them on the way in. Participants needed to know the route. Some passages would have restricted the number of people who could move through them at once. Knowledge of a cave could therefore become specialized knowledge. Someone familiar with the underground route knew where chambers opened, where water appeared, where previous offerings had been placed, and which passages were dangerous. In societies where ritual knowledge and political authority could overlap, control over access to a sacred cave might carry social importance. Archaeologists have argued that caves could help rulers and elites legitimize claims to land and political power, because they were not simply physical spaces but features of sacred geography. This does not mean ordinary people were excluded from every cave. Maya underground ritual occurred at different scales, and some practices were probably household or community activities rather than royal ceremonies. Archaeologists have even studied small food remains and freshwater snail shells in ceremonial cave contexts to understand activities that do not look spectacular in museum displays. Research on jute, a freshwater snail eaten in parts of the Maya region, found shells appearing repeatedly in ceremonial caves, suggesting that food consumption and offering practices could become part of the ritual use of these spaces. That is a useful reminder that religion is rarely composed entirely of golden objects and dramatic sacrifices. Much of ritual life involves ordinary materials given special meaning through where, when, and how they are used. A shell, a small vessel, a little food, or a handful of incense can tell archaeologists as much about repeated human behaviour as a famous jade ornament if the context is preserved. Caves also embodied a combination of qualities that Maya thought could treat as complementary rather than contradictory. They were connected with death, yet they stored life-giving water. They were dark, yet they could be places of creation and renewal. They could inspire fear, yet people deliberately entered them to ask for help. INAH. Research on Maya cave traditions in Yucatan emphasizes this dual character, describing caves as places associated both with life and death, with communication with gods and with dangerous forces. Archaeological and ethno-archaeological evidence indicates that caves could become settings for rituals involving fertility, healing, water, birth, and other concerns in addition to death. This range is important because it prevents the underworld from becoming a one-purpose supernatural prison. The earth below was powerful because many things could emerge from it and disappear into it. Water came from underground sources, seeds were placed in soil before crops appeared, the dead entered the earth. Caves could therefore become places where beginnings and endings occupied the same physical environment. The immense flooded systems of the Yucatan add a final layer that ancient visitors could sense without ever seeing the whole. Modern cave diving has demonstrated that water-filled passages can connect cenotes, separated by considerable distances, forming subterranean networks beneath areas that appear dry and unconnected from above. Scientific studies now measure water chemistry, salinity, groundwater movement, and the interaction between inland freshwater and coastal seawater in these systems. For the Maya, there was no way to produce a complete underground map. A person standing at one cenote could not know exactly how far the water continued, whether it connected with another opening, or how many chambers lay beyond the point where swimming or breathing became impossible. Yet they had enough evidence to know that the underground environment extended farther than ordinary human access allowed. The mystery was not created by ignorance alone. It came from correctly recognizing that an enormous hidden system existed, and then interpreting that system through the religious ideas available to them. This is what makes the phrase, doorway beneath the earth, more than a convenient metaphor. The entrances were real, the descent was real, the water was real, and the objects archaeologists recover from those environments are real. What changed from place to place was what people believed could be reached, influenced, or addressed through them. At one cenote, the concern may have been water and rain. At another cave, it may have involved ancestors, fertility, political legitimacy, or a particular supernatural being. Some spaces were used repeatedly for generations, while others appear to have mattered intensely during particular periods of environmental or social stress. The underground was not one uniform temple stretching beneath the entire Maya world. It was a landscape filled with individual places, each accumulating its own history of visits, stories, dangers, offerings, and relationships. Once people believed that such a place provided access to powerful beings, entering it created a practical problem as well as a religious one. Contact required some form of action. A request for rain might be accompanied by incense. A ceremony might involve food, ceramics, blood, valuable stones, or human remains. Objects could be burned, broken, arranged, buried, or placed into water, and the location selected for the deposit could be as important as the object itself. The caves and cenotes therefore bring us directly to the next question. Archaeology allows us to investigate in unusual detail. What exactly did Maya people carry into these dark places? What did they do with those things once they arrived? And why were some offerings placed so deep underground that recovering them centuries later would require archaeologists to follow the same difficult routes into the earth? Once a cave or cenote was understood as a place where communication with supernatural powers was possible, simply reaching the entrance was only the beginning. People went underground because they intended to do something there. They carried objects, burned incense, prepared food, broke vessels, offered blood, left human remains, and placed materials in locations that were sometimes hundreds of meters from daylight. These actions varied greatly between communities, periods, and individual sites, so there was no single Maya ceremony performed in every cave. What archaeology does show is a repeated pattern of deliberate activity in underground environments, often involving materials that had to be prepared above ground and transported into difficult spaces. The people responsible were not merely exploring. They were bringing things from the human world into a setting where those things could be transferred, transformed, burned, buried, broken, or permanently left behind. That physical transfer is one of the clearest ways to understand Maya offerings, because giving something to the supernatural world often meant removing it from ordinary human use. A ceramic vessel makes a good example. On the surface, a pot might hold water, food, drink, seeds, incense, or some other substance. Producing it required clay, fuel, skill, and time. Decorated vessels required even more labour. Carrying one through a cave created additional difficulty, because Maya ritual specialists did not have padded equipment cases, battery-powered lamps, or the luxury of replacing a vessel through an online order if somebody slipped on the way in. When archaeologists find complete or carefully deposited vessels far underground, the location matters. The pot did not arrive there naturally. Someone chose it, carried it into the cave, and left it. Even broken ceramics can be significant when their distribution shows intentional activity rather than ordinary rubbish disposal. At Actun Tunichil Muknal in Belize, archaeologists have documented large broken pottery vessels in ceremonial areas, along with burials, stone monuments, and other evidence of ritual behaviour. Many of these objects have since become fixed to the cave floor by mineral deposits, leaving them almost exactly where Maya visitors abandoned them centuries ago. Breaking an object during a ceremony may seem wasteful from a practical point of view, but practicality is not always the purpose of ritual. Maya people sometimes deliberately destroyed or altered objects in ceremonial contexts, including breaking ceramic vessels and dispersing their fragments. Archaeologists have documented such behaviour at surface sites as part of what are often called termination rituals, where buildings or objects were intentionally taken out of normal use. Cave deposits require their own careful interpretation, because a broken vessel underground is not automatically proof of one specific ceremony. Pots can break during transport, later visitors can damage them, flowing water can move fragments, and caves are particularly good at turning a simple archaeological situation into a puzzle involving mud, mineral growth, flooding, animals, and several centuries of people stepping in inconvenient places. Even so, repeated patterns of smashed or incomplete vessels in ritual areas show that destruction itself could form part of how an offering was made. One possible way to understand this is to think about the difference between losing an object and giving it. If you accidentally drop a bowl, your first instinct is normally to see whether it can be repaired. If you deliberately break the bowl during a ceremony and leave the pieces in a sacred place, normal ownership has ended. The vessel can no longer return to the kitchen, the storeroom, or the market. It has been removed from circulation. The physical change makes the transfer difficult to reverse. Similar reasoning applies when an object is burned, buried, thrown into deep water, or placed beyond easy recovery. The offering becomes permanent because retrieving it would defeat the action that gave it meaning. Fire provided another way to transform materials. Copal, an aromatic tree resin, was widely used as incense in Mesoamerican ritual, and burned resin has been found in Maya cave contexts. Najtunic in Guatemala offers especially useful evidence. The cave attracted pilgrims over many centuries, and its painted inscriptions record visits by people connected with different Maya political centres. Researchers have recovered ceramic fragments coated with burned copal residue, dating across much of the Classic period, while an inscription records a burning ritual carried out in the cave by lords from Caracol in AD 744. Burning incense underground would have created a very different sensory environment from the same ceremony performed outdoors. Smoke would collect in enclosed chambers, flames would illuminate only part of the surrounding rock, and the smell of resin would mix with damp limestone and the limited air movement inside the cave. Smoke also gave ritual activity a visible movement. A solid lump of resin was placed into fire, transformed and carried into the air as smoke. Maya ceremonies above ground frequently used incense, so its presence underground does not mean that burning itself was unique to caves. The setting changed what the act could accomplish. If a cave was understood as a place connected with gods or ancestors, incense could be burned directly within that sacred environment, rather than from a distant temple or household altar. At Naj Tunik, the repeated evidence of burning across centuries suggests that visitors return to the cave again and again, treating it as a recognised ritual destination rather than a place used for one exceptional event. The inscriptions reinforce that impression because they include verbs connected with arriving, returning, and witnessing events at the cave. People travelled there intentionally, and some came from important cities considerable distances away. Balam Kanche, near Chichen Itza, provides another view of the materials used in underground ceremonies. In its most important chamber, a natural limestone column formed where a stalactite and stalagmite joined, producing a shape compared with a sacred sabre tree. Around this formation, archaeologists found a particularly dense concentration of offerings, including baconical incense burners with representations of cheik, small vessels, limestone incense burners, and miniature grinding stones. Another part of the cave contained 19 incense burners together with pottery, small grinding stones, ash, and beads made from bone, shell, and jade. Near a clear underground pool, investigators recorded 15 incense burners, more than 200 miniature grinding stones, additional full-size grinding stones, plates, jars, and other vessels. Inner interprets the association of water, chak imagery, and grinding stones as evidence of ceremonies concerned with water and agricultural fertility. The miniature grinding stones are especially interesting because they take an ordinary object from daily life and turn it into a ritual representation. Grinding stones were essential tools for preparing maize and other foods. A miniature version could carry the identity or function of the full-sized object without needing to perform the same practical work. Leaving hundreds of small grinding stones near underground water therefore connected a familiar activity associated with food production to a place associated with rain and fertility. The offering did not need to be made from gold to matter. In an agricultural society, an object associated with transforming maize into food could carry a meaning directly connected with survival. That also helps explain why archaeologists study humble materials alongside spectacular ones. A museum display naturally draws attention to jade, carved stone, gold, painted pottery, or a well-preserved human skeleton. A handful of burned resin or a pile of small grinding stones is less likely to appear on a poster, yet those materials can tell us much more about what people repeatedly did. Archaeologists have also found freshwater snail shells known as jute in Maya ceremonial caves, and research suggests that their presence can reflect ritual consumption or offerings. Food could therefore participate in underground ceremonies just as incense and crafted objects did. A ceremony might involve eating, burning, drinking, depositing, and speaking rather than one dramatic act performed in complete silence by someone wearing an elaborate headdress. Some cave finds preserve actual foods. Actun Che Chemhea in Belize contained pottery vessels associated with ritual activity, including one that preserved annatto seeds and another containing maize cobs. The cave also includes a stone monument connected with elite ceremonies. Finds like these give the underground ceremonies an ordinary human dimension. Maize, seeds, vessels, smoke and food were things people already knew from everyday life. Ritual did not require inventing an entirely separate set of materials. Familiar things became offerings because of how and where they were used. Blood was another substance of enormous ceremonial importance in ancient Maya society. Elite bloodletting is represented in Maya art and inscriptions, especially in royal contexts, where rulers and other high-ranking individuals pierced parts of their bodies and offered blood as part of communication with supernatural beings and ancestors. Cave archaeology provides physical evidence that bloodletting could also take place underground. At Aktun Tunikil Muknal, 2 slate stelae were found in a chamber where archaeologists interpret elite rituals as including bloodletting with obsidian blades. The act of voluntarily drawing blood involved offering something that could not simply be manufactured or replaced like a pot. It came directly from the participant's body, making the ceremony intensely personal, while also displaying commitment, status, and endurance. The setting would have increased that intensity. Reaching the ritual areas of Aktun Tunisil Muknal today involves entering through water and travelling through a cave system before climbing into chambers containing archaeological material. Modern visitors and researchers have had to swim, wade, climb over rocks, and carefully remove footwear in sensitive areas to avoid damaging artifacts embedded in mineral deposits. Ancient participants obviously used different methods and did not follow a modern tourism route, but they faced the same basic geology. Anyone carrying ritual equipment into those chambers had already completed a demanding physical journey before a ceremony even began. That effort may have mattered. Sacred places often become significant partly because reaching them is difficult. A ritual performed beside a house, and a ritual performed after hours of climbing, crawling, wading, and navigating darkness do not create the same experience. Distance separates participants from ordinary activity. Physical fatigue changes attention. Restricted entrances limit who can participate. Knowledge of the route becomes important. Once deep underground, turning around and returning home requires another difficult journey. The cave, therefore, creates a natural separation between everyday space and ritual space, without anyone needing to build walls around it. Offerings did not always become more valuable simply because they were carried farther inside. Archaeological work at Aktun Tunichil Muknal found that cave entrances could contain particularly high concentrations of artifacts and evidence of intensive long-term ritual use. This reminds us that sacred geography inside caves could be complex. The deepest point was not automatically the holiest point. Entrances were boundaries where daylight met darkness and outside met inside, making them meaningful locations in their own right. Other chambers might matter because of water, unusual rock formations, acoustics, restricted access, or connections with earlier ritual deposits. The location of an offering was therefore probably chosen for reasons that made sense within the particular cave, rather than through a simple rule that said deeper always meant better. Human remains introduced the most difficult form of offering to discuss. Maya caves and cenotes contain burials as well as individuals interpreted as sacrifices, and distinguishing between the two can be complicated. Burial in a sacred underground place does not necessarily mean that the person was killed there, while the presence of human bones alone does not tell archaeologists exactly how someone died. Researchers examine age, sex, trauma, body position, associated artifacts, location, evidence of burning or dismemberment, and the wider archaeological context before proposing an interpretation. In some caves, the evidence strongly supports sacrificial activity. Aktun Tunishil Muknal, for example, contains the remains of 14 individuals in addition to other ritual materials, and one well-known young person's skeleton became covered with sparkling calcite deposited by cave water over centuries. Other caves contain formal burials whose purpose may have been mortuary rather than sacrificial. The distinction matters because ancient Maya relationships with the dead were complex. A body placed underground could represent a sacrifice, an ancestor, a burial, a political statement, or some combination depending on context. Archaeological research in central Belize shows that rock shelters and caves were used for mortuary purposes across long periods, with patterns changing as settlements and ritual practices changed. It would therefore be misleading to imagine that every skeleton discovered in a cave belonged to someone unwillingly thrown into darkness during a desperate rain ceremony. Archaeology rarely gives us such convenient simplicity. Where sacrifice can be identified, however, the logic of offering becomes extremely direct. A human life is something that cannot be returned once given. Just as valuable jade removed from circulation represents a substantial transfer, the death of a person makes the offering irreversible in the most serious possible way. In Maya societies, sacrifice could be linked with political authority, warfare, calendrical ceremonies, supernatural communication, and environmental concerns. Cave context added another element because the offering could be physically placed into a location associated with gods, ancestors, water, or the underworld. Environmental stress may have increased the intensity of some underground rituals. Research at Cheshemhar Cave in western Belize compared archaeological patterns with evidence for changing climate and found that late classic increases and transformations in cave ritual occurred alongside periods of drying. The researchers argue that similar patterns across the eastern Maya lowlands suggest increasingly intense cave rituals as communities responded to drought. At Cara Blanca, in Belize, a landscape of deep pools interpreted as entrances to the watery underworld appears to have attracted increased pilgrimage during prolonged droughts around AD 800 to 900, with visitors petitioning for rain and successful crops. This provides a very human explanation for why ritual activity might become more urgent. Imagine that the rainy season should already have begun, but the sky remains clear, stored food is declining, reservoir levels are falling, fields have been planted, and seeds are waiting for moisture. Everyone knows what happens if rain does not arrive soon. A ritual specialist can perform the ceremonies that have been passed down through generations, rulers can make offerings, communities can visit sacred water places, and pilgrims can carry gifts towards supernatural powers associated with rain. If the rain still fails, the obvious religious response may not be to abandon the ritual immediately. It may be to perform it more intensely. Modern people do something similar in less supernatural situations. When a computer fails to respond, we often press the same button several times with increasing determination, as though the machine will eventually recognize the seriousness of our intentions. When agriculture, water supplies, and political legitimacy are at stake, repeating or enlarging a ritual response is considerably more understandable. The problem for Maya rulers was that prolonged drought could eventually make failure visible. If a king claimed a special ability to maintain proper relations with supernatural forces, repeated ceremonies followed by continued crop failure could damage more than the harvest. They could damage confidence in the political system that claimed to maintain cosmic order. That is one reason archaeologists investigating cave ritual during the late Classic are interested not only in religion, but in the wider political changes occurring as some Maya kingdoms entered periods of severe instability. Not every person entering a cave was necessarily a king, priest, or noble. Evidence suggests that underground ritual involved different social groups. Elite artifacts and inscriptions at some sites clearly indicate participation by rulers and high-status visitors, but pilgrimage landscapes such as Cara Blanca may also have drawn non-elite participants. Certain ceramic styles in Belize caves have been associated with non-royal elite groups rather than kings themselves. Sacred caves could therefore bring together people with different levels of authority, though access to particular chambers may have been restricted. A large entrance could accommodate a group ceremony, while a narrow interior passage might allow only a few specialists to continue. That difference in access may explain why offerings are sometimes distributed across several zones within the same cave. At Balam Kanche, different groups of objects were deposited around the saber-like stone column, near underground water and in more difficult passages. At Naj Tunic, platforms near the entrance received offerings, while inscriptions and other ritual traces occurred deeper inside. Aktun Tunikil Muknal contains artifact concentrations near entrances, as well as dramatic deposits farther into the system. Rather than one altar at the end of a cave, we may be looking at a sequence of ritual locations that participants encountered as they moved through the underground space. Light itself would have been another necessary ritual resource. Anyone entering beyond the illuminated entrance had to carry fuel. Torches, burning wood or other lamps consumed oxygen, produced smoke, and required constant attention. The archaeological record preserves charcoal in many cave contexts, and researchers have even used charcoal concentrations as a way to estimate changes in how intensively caves were used through time. Every flame left a small physical trace, while also allowing ceremonies to take place. Darkness was therefore not an abstract religious symbol added by later interpretation. It was a practical condition that shaped movement, visibility, and the amount of time people could remain underground. A person participating in such a ceremony would experience objects differently from the way we encounter them in museums today. An incense burner displayed behind glass is clean, isolated and illuminated from every angle. Underground, it may have been hot, producing smoke, surrounded by voices, drums, prayers, dripping water, and moving torchlight. A ceramic plate may have contained food before it was deliberately placed or broken. An obsidian blade may have been used against living skin. A grinding stone may have represented maize production, rather than existing as an anonymous artifact. Archaeology gives us the objects, but the ceremony was made from actions. That is why the arrangement of artifacts matters so much. Archaeologists do not simply count how many pots came from a cave. They map where each object was found, which materials occur together, whether deposits are near water or unusual formations, how deeply they lie within the cave, whether objects were burned or broken, and whether human remains were placed nearby. At Aktun Tunishil Muknal, researchers created detailed spatial records of artifact concentrations to understand how different parts of the cave were being used. The goal is to reconstruct behaviour from patterns that individual objects cannot explain by themselves. Occasionally, an underground context survives with such little disturbance that archaeologists encounter something remarkably close to the final arrangement created by ancient participants. Balamku near Chichen Itza is one such case. The cave was discovered in the 20th century, sealed again, and later investigated by the Gran Acuífero Maya project. Ina describes the site as preserving pre-Hispanic offerings in unusually intact context because the material remained largely undisturbed for centuries. That kind of preservation is invaluable. Archaeologists often work with sites that have been looted, flooded, collapsed, reused or disturbed by generations of later visitors. An intact ritual deposit gives them the chance to study not merely what objects were present, but how people arranged them. Mineral growth can preserve another kind of information. At caves such as Aktun Tunichil Muknal, dripping water has deposited calcite over pottery and human remains, gradually attaching objects to the cave itself. The effect is visually striking, but scientifically, it also emphasizes how long the material remained untouched. A vessel left after a Maya ceremony eventually became part of the limestone floor around it. The people who placed it could not have predicted that particular result, yet centuries of geology ended up sealing some of their ritual actions into place. By looking at all of these materials together, the purpose of cave offerings becomes easier to understand without pretending that every ceremony had the same explanation. People approached underground places to communicate with supernatural powers, petition for water and crops, maintain relationships with ancestors, perform elite ceremonies, conduct bloodletting, bury the dead, make sacrifices, and participate in rituals whose exact purpose may no longer be recoverable. The offerings could consist of expensive jade or ordinary food, a carefully made incense burner or a small grinding stone, a few drops of blood or a human body. What joined them was not monetary value but transfer. Something belonging to the human world was carried toward a place understood as connected with another region of the cosmos, and deliberately changed or left there. The darkness was therefore not empty. It contained accumulated evidence of earlier visits. A person entering a cave in the 8th century might encounter vessels left generations before, old platforms, burnt areas, human bones, stone monuments, or formations already associated with stories and ceremonies. Sacred space could build its own history. Every new deposit joined older ones, making the cave increasingly connected with the actions of ancestors, rulers, pilgrims, and ritual specialists who had entered before. For archaeologists arriving many centuries later, those layers of activity create both an opportunity and a problem. A cave floor covered with vessels, charcoal, bones, shells, tools, incense burners, and fragments may preserve an extraordinary record of ritual life, but none of those objects comes with a label explaining who carried it there or what words were spoken when it was deposited. Researchers have to reconstruct that information from placement, dates, residues, skeletal evidence, inscriptions, art, geology, and comparison with other sites. As we move farther underground, the question therefore shifts from what the Maya intended to give to the world below toward what those gifts have allowed modern archaeology to discover, because the caves have preserved ceramics, paintings, human remains, ritual equipment, inscriptions, food, and even fragile materials that rarely survive anywhere else. For archaeologists, caves create a strange reversal of the usual problem. At many ancient Maya cities, centuries of rain, roots, farming, construction, looting, and tropical decay have damaged or erased the objects people once used. Wood disappears, cloth rots, food decays, painted surfaces fade, and anything left in an exposed plaza has a very long time to be moved by humans, animals, weather, or vegetation. Underground, the situation can be completely different. A cave may be difficult to reach, protected from direct sunlight, and isolated from later construction. Objects can remain where they were placed for hundreds of years. Mineral-rich water may slowly cover pottery, or bones with calcite. Deep pools can preserve materials that almost never survive on dry land. A sealed passage can protect an entire ritual deposit from later disturbance. The result is that some of the clearest evidence for Maya relationships with the world below comes from places where ancient participants apparently expected their offerings never to return. That does not mean cave archaeology is easy. In many ways, it is considerably harder than excavating a conventional site. Archaeologists may have to crawl, climb, swim, work around underground water, maintain lighting, protect fragile formations, and record objects without moving them. Flooding can redistribute artifacts. Calcite can attach objects to the floor. Human remains may be scattered or extremely fragile. A narrow passage that an ancient visitor crossed with a ceramic vessel can be difficult enough for a modern researcher carrying cameras, measuring equipment, batteries, notebooks, protective gear, and the growing realization that nobody designed the cave with archaeology in mind. Yet precisely because these environments are difficult to reach, they sometimes preserve evidence that has disappeared almost everywhere else. One of the most remarkable examples is Balamku, a cave in the wider landscape of Chichen Itza in Yucatan. Local farmers first brought the cave to archaeological attention in 1966. An archaeologist inspected it, recorded the presence of archaeological material, and then had the entrance sealed. For roughly half a century, the cave remained closed. When researchers from the Gran Acuífero Maya project reopened it in 2018, they encountered an extraordinary situation. Ritual objects were still sitting in the chambers where ancient Maya visitors had left them, largely undisturbed. Ina describes Balamku as an archaeological context of unusual importance, precisely because the remains had stayed in their original positions for centuries. Researchers identified numerous incense burners, vessels, decorated plates, and other ceremonial objects, some surrounded by stalagmite growth that had formed after the offerings were placed. Reaching those objects was not a matter of walking through a large entrance and turning on the lights. Archaeologists had to move through extremely narrow passages, sometimes crawling flat for considerable distances before reaching offering chambers. More than 150 ritual objects were identified during the early investigation, and several chambers containing offerings were recorded. Some incense burners carried imagery associated with rain deities, while other objects displayed symbols connected with the sacred Xiba and Maya ideas about the structure of the universe. The difficulty of access makes their presence particularly significant. Whoever carried those vessels into Balamku had to know the route, and deliberately transport them through passages where movement was slow and uncomfortable. This was not a convenient storage area. The inconvenience was part of what tells archaeologists that something unusual was happening there. Balamku is valuable for another reason. Archaeology depends heavily on context, which is simply the relationship between an object and everything surrounding it. A ceramic incense burner removed from a cave and placed on a table can still be studied for its shape, decoration, clay, manufacturing technique, and approximate date. What disappears is the information about exactly where it stood, what objects were beside it, whether it contained ash, whether it was near water, whether mineral formations had grown over it, and whether several generations of deposits were arranged around the same location. Looting destroys that information very quickly. An object may remain beautiful after being removed, but much of its archaeological meaning has been torn away. At Balamku, researchers were given the rare opportunity to study a large ritual assemblage without first discovering that someone had already carried the most attractive pieces out in a bag. A different kind of underground record survives at Balamkanchi, another cave associated with the landscape around Chichen Itza. The archaeologists found pots, incense burners, miniature grinding stones, and offering positioned around a natural limestone column formed where a stalactite and stalagmite joined. The formation resembles a tree and has been interpreted in relation to the sacred saber and the axis connecting different regions of the Maya cosmos. Farther into the cave, where the cavern meets the aquifer, additional incense burners and grinding stones were deposited near water. Pottery indicates that ceremonies took place there across a very long period, beginning in the late pre-classic and continuing into the post-classic, with particularly intensive use between about AD 900 and 1200. The miniature grinding stones found there are easy to overlook beside more dramatic discoveries, but archaeologists pay attention to them because they connect ritual activity with maize processing and ordinary household labour. A miniature object does not need to function exactly like its full-sized equivalent in order to represent it. Hundreds of years after the ceremony, a small grinding stone found near an underground pool can still preserve the connection between food production, agricultural fertility, water, and the sacred landscape. The same principle applies to small vessels and incense burners. Archaeology is often at its most revealing when an object that looks unimpressive by itself appears repeatedly in a meaningful location. Naj tunic in Guatemala provides something rarer still, writing on the cave walls. The cave began attracting pilgrims very early, with stone platforms constructed near its entrance by around the 1st century BC. Visitors placed ceramic offerings and jadeite pendants near large stalagmite formations, and later Maya visitors went much farther by leaving painted texts and images inside. Roughly 40 painted inscriptions are known from the cave, many dating to the 7th and 8th centuries. Instead of forcing archaeologists to infer every action from broken pots and charcoal, some of these texts actually refer to people arriving, returning, and witnessing events. Emblem glyphs associated with different Maya cities show that visitors did not come only from the immediate neighbourhood. Naj tunic had become important enough to attract elite participants from across the region. One inscription records that lords connected with Karakol performed a burning ritual there in AD 744. Archaeologists also recovered ceramic fragments coated with charred copal resin spanning much of the Classic period. That combination is unusually useful. The writing tells us that burning rituals occurred, while the physical residues show repeated incense burning over centuries. Text and artifact support one another. We are not simply guessing that a blackened vessel might have been used ceremonially. The cave itself contains written evidence describing ritual actions of the same general kind. Naj tunic also changes the way we should imagine Maya pilgrimage. a sacred cave could become important beyond the community living closest to it. People were willing to travel there, and prominent visitors wanted their presence or actions recorded. A cave could therefore operate much like a major ceremonial destination on the surface, except that its architecture had largely been created by geology. Platforms and modifications might be added by humans, but the chambers, columns, passages and darkness were already present. In a sense, nature had completed most of the building work several thousand years before the guests arrived, which must have been welcome news to anyone responsible for organising labour. Paintings and inscriptions are especially vulnerable underground. Moisture, mineral deposits, touching, smoke, and changes in airflow can damage them, so modern archaeologists have learned that discovery itself can become a threat. Opening a sealed space changes temperature and humidity. Visitors introduce carbon dioxide, dust, microorganisms, and accidental contact. Researchers therefore increasingly use photography, digital mapping, three-dimensional recording, remote sensing, and other methods that allow information to be collected while reducing physical disturbance. The goal is no longer simply to remove interesting objects and place them in a museum. In a well-preserved cave, leaving things exactly where they are can sometimes provide more information than excavation. Actun Tunichil Muknal in Belize demonstrates why careful recording matters so much. The cave contains one of the best-known collections of Maya ritual material preserved underground, including large broken ceramic vessels, stone monuments, and the remains of at least 14 individuals. Dripping mineral-rich water has coated many objects with calcite, fixing pottery and bones into the cave environment over time. Two slate stelae have been interpreted as locations associated with elite bloodletting, including the use of obsidian blades. Archaeologists examining the cave found that ritual material occurred not only in the deepest chambers, but also in significant concentrations near entrances, showing that different areas of the cave could serve different ceremonial purposes. The human remains at Actun Tunichil Muknal have received much of the public attention, especially a young individual whose skeleton has become covered by sparkling calcite. The visual effect is memorable, but archaeology has to move beyond the appearance of the bones. Researchers ask where each individual was placed, whether the body was buried formally or deposited differently, whether there is evidence of trauma, what age the person was, what objects were nearby, and whether later flooding or human activity disturbed the remains. A skeleton in a cave is evidence of a dead person, but it does not automatically explain why that person is there. Sacrifice is one possibility in some contexts. Burial is another. Maya caves were used for both, and treating every underground skeleton as a sacrificial victim would replace archaeology with a horror story. The same caution applies to the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza. Early 20th century dredging and later archaeological work recovered human remains, together with hundreds of objects made from jade, gold, copper, wood, ceramic, textile, copal, and other materials. Some offerings originated far beyond Yucatan. Gold objects show connections extending towards Central America, while jade pieces came through trade and political networks linking different Maya regions. Wooden objects and textiles are particularly important because those materials normally disappear at terrestrial sites. The unusual conditions in the cenote preserved parts of the Maya material world that archaeologists otherwise know mainly from painted or carved representations. One offering from the sacred cenote contained copal resin together with jadeite beads inside a ceramic bowl. Objects like this reveal that offerings were sometimes assembled from combinations of substances rather than thrown into the water individually. The cenote therefore preserves something close to ritual packages, materials selected, brought together, and deposited as a unit. Hundreds of jade pieces demonstrate the scale of the giving. Jade was extremely valuable in Maya society, associated with elite status, life, water, and preciousness. Depositing it into deep water meant removing wealth from human circulation, rather than displaying it indefinitely in a palace. Archaeologists have also had to revise old assumptions about who was sacrificed at Chichen Itza. Popular stories once emphasized young women and girls being thrown into the sacred cenote, partly because colonial descriptions and early interpretations were repeated so often that they became almost impossible to separate from the site's public image. More recent osteological work showed a more complicated picture, including both males and females. Then ancient DNA added another layer of information from a separate subterranean mass burial near the sacred cenote. In 2024, researchers published genome-wide data from 64 children interred in a chultun, an underground feature connected with a small cave. All 64 individuals analysed were genetically male, and several were close relatives. Most strikingly, researchers identified 2 pairs of identical twins. The burials accumulated over several centuries, broadly between about AD 500 and 900 in the sample studied. The twin finding immediately attracted attention, because twin heroes occupy such an important place in Maya mythology, especially in the Kitsch hero twins narrative we have already followed. It would be tempting to announce that archaeologists had discovered a direct reenactment of the Popol Vuh at Chichen Itza, but the researchers themselves are more careful. The Popol Vuh was recorded much later in a different Maya linguistic and cultural region. Twin symbolism existed more broadly in Mesoamerica, and the presence of identical twins in a ritual burial is remarkable, but archaeology cannot recover the exact spoken explanation used by the people who conducted the ceremony. What the genetic evidence does establish is that biological relatedness mattered in this particular burial group, and that male children, including twins and other close relatives, were repeatedly selected. That is already much more precise than older assumptions based only on skeletal appearance. Ancient DNA illustrates how dramatically cave and underground archaeology has changed. A few generations ago, excavators might have described a skeleton's approximate age and attempted to determine sex from bone shape, something that is especially difficult with children, because many sex-related skeletal differences develop after puberty. Today, researchers can extract surviving DNA, identify genetic sex, detect close relatives, compare ancient individuals with other populations, and combine those results with isotope analysis to study diet and mobility. Radiocarbon dating can establish when individuals lived. Microscopic analysis can identify residues inside vessels. Chemical techniques can detect pigments, resins, and food remains. 3-dimensional scanning can record a chamber before anything is touched. What looked to earlier researchers like a collection of bones and pots can now become evidence about family relationships, diet, travel, chronology, ritual selection, and the sequence of actions performed underground. Wooden objects provide another example of information that caves sometimes preserve unexpectedly. A small wooden figurine recovered in 1999 from a cave near the late Classic Maya center of Muclabaltzul in southern Belize was interpreted by researchers as possibly representing an ancestral deity or historical figure. Wooden ritual objects appear in classic Maya imagery, but actual examples are rare because tropical conditions normally destroy wood. The cave context therefore preserved a category of object that Maya artists depicted, but archaeologists seldom recover. Researchers studying the figurine argued that its placement was consistent with the role of caves in ceremonies connected with ancestors and earth-focused supernatural powers. Other caves preserve architecture underground. Acton Chaput in Belize contains walls, terraces, raised platforms, human remains, ceramics, stone artifacts, and animal material, with evidence spanning from roughly 300 BC to around AD 1000. Some chambers had been partly walled. The importance of such modifications is easy to miss. Building a wall inside a cave means that ancient visitors did not simply accept the natural space exactly as they found it. They organised movement, created boundaries, raised surfaces, or altered access. In effect, they constructed ritual architecture inside geological architecture. That behaviour complicates the modern distinction between a natural cave and a built temple. A Maya visitor might enter a naturally formed chamber whose floor had been modified, whose entrance had been walled, whose walls had been painted, and whose interior contained platforms and offerings accumulated across generations. The cave remained natural, but human activity had turned it into a culturally organised place. The same transformation happens when a society marks a mountain with shrines, or builds around a spring. Sacred landscapes are rarely untouched landscapes. People create meaning partly by modifying what was already meaningful. Ceramics remain the most common archaeological material in many caves, because fired clay survives where wood, food, cloth, and flesh do not. Pottery styles can help date periods of use, identify connections with particular regions, and sometimes suggest the status of participants. At Acton Nakbe in Belize, for example, archaeologists recovered moulded carved ceramic fragments dating roughly to the Terminal Classic and early Post-Classic, a style commonly associated with elite but non-royal contexts. Similar ceramics occurred at nearby surface settlements, allowing researchers to connect cave activity with the society living outside. A cave does not therefore have to contain a royal inscription before archaeologists can begin asking who used it. Charcoal supplies another kind of evidence. Fires leave burnt wood behind, and radiocarbon dating of charcoal can help establish when particular cave areas were used. Concentrations of charcoal may also indicate periods of more intensive visitation. Burned copal residue can identify incense use, while soot on ceilings can sometimes record repeated lighting or ritual fires. Mineral deposits growing over charcoal or pottery provide relative sequences showing that the objects were in place before later formations developed. Nothing about a dark smear on stone looks especially exciting at first glance, but in archaeology an unattractive patch of carbon can be more useful than an impressive sculpture if it answers the right question. Then there are the absences. Archaeologists sometimes find areas of caves that contain almost no material, despite lying close to chambers filled with artifacts. That pattern can be just as informative as a dense deposit. It may indicate that movement was controlled, that one formation mattered while another did not, that ceremonies focused on water, or that certain spaces were intentionally kept clear. Artifact distribution at Aktun Tunishil Muknal has been mapped carefully for this reason. Researchers used detailed plans and spatial grids to examine clustering rather than treating the cave as one enormous container of ritual debris. Archaeological meaning often comes from asking why something is here rather than 3 meters away. Water makes that interpretation more difficult because caves change after people leave. Heavy rains can flood passages and move artifacts. Bones can be displaced. Sediment can bury objects. Calcite can cover surfaces. Pools can rise and fall. Animals may disturb remains. Later Maya visitors might move older offerings while performing new ceremonies. Colonial or modern visitors can add another layer of disturbance. Archaeologists therefore reconstruct site formation processes before deciding that the present arrangement is exactly what ancient participants intended. A pot lying beside a skeleton today may have been placed there deliberately, washed there centuries later, or moved by someone investigating the cave before professional recording began. This caution is especially important because the Maya underworld attracts dramatic interpretations very easily. Human bones, dark caves, mysterious paintings, and stories about death gods almost seem designed for sensational documentaries. Archaeology has to resist that temptation. A cave full of offerings does not prove that ancient visitors expected to meet the lords of Xibalba face to face. A skeletal deposit does not prove sacrifice unless the context supports it. A rain god incense burner does not tell us the exact prayer that accompanied it. Paintings do not automatically explain every object nearby. The strength of the archaeological case comes from repeated patterns across many sites, deliberate entry into caves, offerings placed near water and unusual formations, incense burning, ceramics, human remains, bloodletting equipment, inscriptions describing visits and rituals, architectural modifications, and evidence that some locations were revisited for centuries. Maya caves were unquestionably important religious spaces. The uncertainty lies in reconstructing the particular meaning of each ceremony. This broader importance is also supported by Aina research, emphasizing the long-standing dual role of caves in Maya thought as places associated with life and death, contact with gods, and potentially dangerous forces. Perhaps the most revealing discovery, then, is not any single spectacular artifact. It is the consistency of human effort. People repeatedly carried things underground when leaving them on the surface would have been easier. They travelled to particular caves from distant cities. They painted walls where only people entering the cave could see them. They constructed platforms in darkness. They brought incense burners into narrow passages, deposited jade in deep water, carried food and grinding stones toward underground pools, placed human bodies in subterranean spaces, and returned to some of these locations across many generations. Archaeology cannot recover every belief behind those actions, but it does not need to. Behaviour on that scale tells us that the underground landscape had genuine social and religious importance. Modern discoveries have therefore changed the old picture of Maya religion in a very practical way. Temples and pyramids remain essential, but they are only the visible half of the evidence. Some ceremonies happened far from monumental plazas, in places that could not hold enormous crowds and were not designed to be seen from a distance. An incense burner deposited deep inside Balamku was not a public monument advertising royal power to everyone passing through the city. A painted inscription in Naj tunic required someone to enter the cave to encounter it. A vessel left beside underground water might never have been seen again after the flames went out, and the participants returned to the surface. These acts were meaningful even when most of society could not watch them. There is an obvious irony in the fact that objects deliberately removed from ordinary human view now allow us to see Maya religious life more clearly. Some of the people who left these offerings may have expected them to remain with the powers below indefinitely. Instead, centuries later, archaeologists follow the same passages and find vessels exactly where they were abandoned. Fingerprints occasionally still visible in clay, soot preserved on surfaces, bones covered in mineral growth, and painted texts identifying visitors whose cities disappeared long ago. The cave becomes an archive, though it was never created as one. The archive also extends underwater, and this is where the scale of the story begins to change. Cenotes, once investigated as isolated openings, are now understood as entrances into enormous hydrological networks beneath the Yucatan. Modern divers can move through passages that ancient Maya visitors could see only at their accessible edges. Archaeologists and geologists can map connections between sinkholes, identify submerged chambers, analyse groundwater, and investigate sites that have remained underwater for centuries. What looked from the surface like dozens of separate sacred pools can belong to a much larger hidden system. That discovery does not prove that Maya descriptions of a supernatural underworld were literal geography, but it does help explain why the idea of an extensive world beneath the human one could feel entirely reasonable. Ancient Maya people knew that water disappeared into the earth. They knew that caves continued beyond daylight. They knew that some cenotes descended farther than they could explore. They entered enough of those places to leave behind ceramics, incense, paintings, human remains, wooden objects, jade, grinding stones, food, and written records of pilgrimage. Modern archaeology has now followed them downward and discovered that the physical underground environment is far larger than anyone standing at a single cave entrance could have known, which leaves us with one final part of the landscape to examine: the vast flooded cave systems beneath Yucatan, where separate cenotes become connected by hidden rivers, and the ancient idea of another world below begins with a geological reality on a scale that is difficult to appreciate from the surface. By the time archaeologists began diving systematically into the cenotes of the Yucatan Peninsula, One of the strangest things they discovered was that the ancient Maya had been correct about an important part of the landscape, even if modern science explains it very differently. There really is another extensive environment beneath the surface. It contains no known palaces belonging to the lords of Xibalba, no supernatural court waiting beyond a crossroads, and no hidden population of death gods arranging ball games for unfortunate visitors. What exists instead is an enormous network of limestone cavities, flooded tunnels, underground water, submerged chambers, collapsed openings, and passages extending for hundreds of kilometers beneath areas that can look completely ordinary from above. A person walking through the forest near Tulum may pass several cenotes without realizing that some of those openings lead into the same underground system. Modern cave divers can follow routes between them and map connections that would have been impossible for ancient visitors to see. The result is a physical landscape that helps explain why the idea of a connected world below the human one could have seemed completely reasonable to Maya communities living above it. The basic reason for this hidden landscape is limestone. Much of the Yucatan Peninsula is formed from a vast carbonate platform, and limestone reacts slowly with water containing dissolved carbon dioxide. Rain falls through the atmosphere and soil, becomes slightly acidic, and works its way through fractures in the rock. Over immense periods, the water enlarges those fractures. Tiny openings become channels, channels become passages, and passages can eventually become caves large enough for people to enter. In the low, relatively flat parts of the peninsula, especially toward the Caribbean coast, surface rivers are limited because rainfall drains efficiently into the porous ground instead of remaining above it. The landscape may therefore appear dry at the surface even while an enormous quantity of fresh water is present only a short distance below. And it describes the peninsula as a largely limestone environment, where rainwater cuts underground routes and, on reaching the water table, contributes to subterranean rivers, caves, caverns, and cenotes. The word river needs a little care here because these underground systems do not always behave like familiar surface rivers, with obvious banks and a single channel flowing from one place to another. Groundwater can move through fractures, porous rock, chambers, and large cave conduits. Near the Caribbean coast, fresh water from rainfall sits above denser salt water, entering from the sea, creating a layered coastal aquifer. Between the two is a mixing zone known as a halocline. Scientists working in the Oxbell Hare cave network have measured changes in salinity, water level, flow, temperature, dissolved gases, and other properties to understand how this subterranean estuary behaves. Their instruments confirm that the caves are not isolated pools. They participate in an active groundwater system responding to rainfall, storms, sea level, tides, and the movement of fresh water toward the coast. A modern cave diver entering one of these systems experiences something an ancient Maya visitor could never have seen in full. At first, the cenote may resemble a natural pool. Beneath the surface, however, an opening leads sideways under the limestone. The diver follows a guideline through a submerged passage, perhaps moving beneath a ceiling where stalactites still hang from a period when the cave was dry. Some tunnels open into broad rooms, while others narrow enough to make turning around difficult. The fresh water can be exceptionally clear. Then the diver reaches the halocline, where fresh water and salt water meet. Light bends differently through the mixing layers, making the water temporarily look blurred or oily. Below that boundary, the chemistry and temperature can change. None of this requires anything supernatural, but even with modern equipment, detailed maps, compressed gas, powerful lights and training, the environment remains unfamiliar enough to demand constant attention. The presence of submerged stalactites and stalagmites tells another part of the geological story. These formations grow in air-filled caves when mineral-rich water drips from ceilings and deposits calcium carbonate. They cannot form in the same way while completely submerged. Finding them underwater therefore shows that parts of today's flooded systems were once dry. During colder phases of the Pleistocene, huge amounts of water were locked in continental ice sheets, and global sea level was lower. The water table in Yucatan was also lower, leaving many coastal caves open to air. Later, as ice melted and sea level rose, groundwater rose with it and flooded passages that had existed as dry caves for thousands of years. Research on the Sakakton system describes drowned cave formations and air-filled upper passages as evidence of these major fluctuations in sea level. This changing water level is one reason underwater caves around northeastern Quintana Roo have become so extensive. Modern exploration has mapped systems whose scale is difficult to imagine from the surface. In the Quintana Roo Speleological Survey's January 2025 compilation, Sistema Oxbel Hair contained nearly 497 kilometres of surveyed underwater passage, while Sistema Sakakton contained about 380 kilometres. Those numbers continue to change as trained explorers establish new connections and survey additional tunnels, so they should be treated as snapshots of exploration rather than final measurements. What matters for our story is the scale. Individual cenotes can provide entrances into cave networks extending hundreds of kilometres. Imagine knowing only the surface entrances. One cenote lies near your community. Another is several kilometres away. A third lies deeper in the forest. To you they appear separate because the limestone between them looks solid. You lower containers into one opening and collect water. Someone enters another cave and finds passages disappearing into darkness. At a third location, water rises beneath a roof of stone. You have no way to follow flooded passages for kilometres or construct a complete map of the aquifer, yet you can observe that water exists almost everywhere below the surface, that openings frequently lead to larger spaces, and that caves continue beyond the point where humans can safely travel. The conclusion that the Earth contains an extensive hidden region would not be irrational. The geological explanation would differ from the religious one, but the observation that something enormous existed below would be correct. These cenotes also behave as visible points where this hidden system touches the surface. Some formed when cave roofs collapsed, leaving circular or irregular openings. Others expose water through different karst processes. Their shapes vary widely, which means there was never one standard appearance for a sacred entrance. An open cenote filled with sunlight creates a completely different impression from a narrow vertical shaft. A cavern cenote may still have most of its roof intact, so visitors descend into shadow before reaching the water. Others are deep enough that their true dimensions were not recognised until modern divers entered them. At Gibil Chaltun, for example, cenote Slaka was long regarded in relatively simple terms as a water source, but 20th century underwater exploration revealed that it extends into a substantial submerged cave reaching roughly 40 metres in depth. Archaeologists recovered tens of thousands of ceramic vessels and ritual objects from the cenote, including wooden artifacts and a stingray spine associated with bloodletting. Ina explicitly connects those deposits with Maya beliefs that cenotes could provide access to the underworld. Slaka is a particularly useful example because it combines nearly every aspect of the story in one location. It provided practical water for a major settlement. It contained archaeological offerings. It possessed an underwater extension hidden from people standing at the edge. Its physical importance and religious importance did not cancel one another. The same opening could provide drinking water on one occasion and become a setting for ritual behaviour on another. For modern thinking, this mixture sometimes feels contradictory because we are accustomed to separating utility from sacred meaning. We tend to imagine a well as practical and a shrine as religious. Maya communities did not need to make that distinction so sharply. A place could be useful precisely because it participated in forces essential to life, and those same forces could make it sacred. The relationship becomes even clearer when drought enters the picture. If most usable water is underground and rain is essential for agriculture, then a failure of rainfall connects the sky and the world below in a very practical way. Crops begin to suffer above ground while communities become increasingly dependent on stored and underground water. rituals directed toward rain deities or performed at caves and cenotes are therefore not random choices of location. The place where water physically exists becomes an obvious place to petition the powers believed to control it. Archaeological studies from Belize have found evidence that cave ritual intensified during periods associated with severe drought, suggesting that some communities responded to environmental stress by increasing activity at places connected with water and supernatural power. The Maya did not know the atmospheric mechanisms controlling rainfall in the terms used by modern meteorology, but they knew exactly what prolonged drought did to maize fields. There is another geological feature in northern Yucatan that would have been invisible to ancient Maya observers, even though it helped shape the pattern of water around them. Tens of millions of years before Maya civilization existed, a large asteroid struck the region near what is now Chicxulub. The impact produced an enormous buried crater. Much later, fractures and differences in the limestone around the crater rim influenced groundwater movement and dissolution. From space, modern remote sensing can identify a broad arc of cenotes following portions of that buried structure. NASA describes a prominent ring of sinkholes associated with the rim of the Chicxulub impact crater, where fractures and groundwater movement contributed to cenote formation. Ancient Maya communities obviously did not know that an asteroid impact had shaped parts of their groundwater landscape roughly 66 million years earlier. They had no reason to connect the pattern of cenotes with the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs, and placing that explanation into their beliefs would be pure invention. What matters is that even the distribution of some water openings was influenced by processes far beneath and far before the human world. The landscape carried a geological history that nobody living on its surface could see. Maya explanations used gods, sacred geography and cosmology to make sense of features produced by processes that modern geology would identify only much later. The coastal systems add yet another invisible connection, because some groundwater eventually reaches the sea. Studies of the southeastern Yucatan aquifer show that flooded cave conduits can carry fresh water from inland recharge areas toward coastal springs and marine environments. This means that rain falling over the forest can descend through soil and limestone, enter groundwater, move through subterranean routes, pass beneath land where people live, and eventually emerge near the Caribbean. Someone standing beside a cenote sees only a small opening into that movement. Modern hydrology allows us to understand it as part of a regional system, but for an ancient observer, the same pattern provided direct evidence that the Earth was active internally. Scientists have even discovered ecosystems operating in complete darkness within these flooded systems. USGS-supported research in Oxbow Har found that methane and dissolved organic substances help support microbial communities, which in turn contribute to food webs involving cave-adapted animals. In deeper parts of the system, little visible plant debris from the surface arrives, yet life persists through chemical pathways that do not depend directly on sunlight in the ordinary way. There is something useful about this discovery when thinking about the ancient idea of a living world below, provided we do not push the comparison too far. Maya people did not know about methane-eating microorganisms, and there is no reason to pretend their underworld stories were secret descriptions of microbial ecology. The point is simpler. The underground really is an environment with its own water chemistry, organisms, currents, and physical conditions. It is not merely a hollow gap beneath the surface. Modern explorers remain dependent on cenotes in much the same physical sense that ancient people were. The openings are still the access points. A diver cannot simply begin at a road and swim through limestone. Equipment has to be transported to a cenote, assembled at the edge, and carried into the water. The route must be surveyed carefully, and a continuous guideline is normally maintained because losing direction inside a submerged cave can be fatal. Visibility that appears perfect can disappear if sediment is disturbed. A passage wide enough on the way in may become difficult while carrying additional equipment on the way out. Gas supplies must allow for emergencies. Even experienced explorers treat these systems with considerable respect because there is no direct route to the surface once they have travelled beneath hundreds of metres of solid rock. That modern experience gives us a useful sense of scale without requiring us to project modern cave diving emotions onto ancient Maya ritual specialists. Ancient people could enter dry caves and accessible water areas, but they could not follow the permanently flooded networks in the way scuba-trained explorers do today. Their knowledge ended at the water surface or at the limit of safe breath-hold diving. Beyond that point, passages continued where humans could not. A pool in the back of a sacred cave therefore did not necessarily feel like an endpoint. It could look like the beginning of something inaccessible. That distinction helps explain why an underground water source could become a convincing boundary between worlds. A solid wall tells you that the route ends. Deep water does not. You can see that space continues, but you cannot follow it. Anything placed into that water can disappear from ordinary reach while remaining physically present somewhere below. An offering dropped into a cenote sinks beyond sight. A human body placed into deep water leaves the surface environment entirely. Incense smoke moves into the air of a cave while liquids disappear into cracks and pools. These actions create a practical sense of transfer because objects genuinely move from one accessible environment into another. The Maya did not need a philosophical argument proving the existence of a world below. The landscape supplied daily reminders. Graves placed the dead beneath houses and plazas. Seeds entered soil before crops emerged. Rainwater vanished into limestone. Cenotes exposed deep pools where surface rivers were scarce. Caves led downward into areas beyond daylight. Unusual formations grew from ceilings and floors. Water sounds could come from passages too narrow or dangerous to follow. Archaeological offerings accumulated in places already used by earlier generations. Every one of these experiences reinforced the idea that the ground was not simply inert material separating humans from nothing. This does not mean that archaeology can identify exactly what every Maya person believed while approaching a cenote. Beliefs varied across regions and centuries, and people living in the Maya world were no more intellectually identical than people living in Europe or Asia during the same periods. One community might emphasize a particular rain deity, another an ancestral connection, another a local sacred being associated with a cave. A ruler could use access to a cave as part of political authority, while nearby families might think primarily about water, healing, fertility, or inherited traditions. The Quiche name Xibalba should therefore remain tied to the tradition in which it is recorded rather than casually applied to every underground ritual site in the Maya world. What archaeology does allow us to say is stronger than a guess. Caves and cenotes were repeatedly treated as significant places. Maya people carried offerings into them, burned incense there, left ceramics and food, performed bloodletting, placed or buried human remains, painted and wrote on cave walls, modified underground chambers, and revisited some sites across centuries. INAH research on Yucatec Maya cave traditions emphasizes the dual character of these places as settings associated with both life and death, contact with gods, fertility, water, and potentially dangerous forces. When that archaeological pattern is combined with the actual geology beneath Yucatan, the religious importance of the underground becomes much easier to understand. The central question was never whether archaeologists would eventually find a literal hidden city matching the descriptions of Xibalba. That would ask Maya religion to function like a modern geographical claim and would miss what made the landscape powerful in the first place. A supernatural realm did not need to be physically mapped from beginning to end in order for a cave to serve as a real point of contact with it. Sacred geography works through places people can approach. The entrance is enough to establish a relationship with what lies beyond. We still do something similar when we treat boundaries as meaningful. A shoreline is not the whole ocean, but standing at the shore gives direct access to it. A doorway is not the building, but crossing it changes where you are. A grave is not the entire world of the dead, yet it creates a specific physical location where the living interact with memory and death. For Maya communities, caves and cenotes could operate as boundaries of this kind. The opening itself belonged to the human landscape, while what extended below could belong simultaneously to geology, water, ancestors, gods, and underworld traditions. Modern maps have made the hidden part of the Yucatan larger rather than smaller. The more divers explore, the more connections appear. Systems once considered separate have been joined after an unexplored tunnel was finally surveyed. New cenotes provide access to previously unmapped regions. Passages continue under jungle, roads, settlements, and modern development. The Quintana Roo Speleological Survey continues to update records precisely because the map is not finished. An ancient Maya person standing beside a cenote could never have known the dimensions that modern surveys now reveal. But the intuition that one opening might connect with a much larger subterranean environment was closer to physical reality than the surface landscape suggested. That hidden connection also makes the aquifer extremely vulnerable. Limestone allows water to move rapidly, which means contamination introduced at the surface can reach groundwater and travel through the same networks that provide fresh water to people and ecosystems. Modern urban development, tourism, wastewater, roads, and construction therefore create risks for an underground system that remains difficult to monitor comprehensively. The water beneath Yucatan is not an archaeological curiosity left behind with the ancient Maya. It is still a functioning resource on which modern communities depend. Research describes the peninsula's karst aquifer as the principal freshwater source for human populations and groundwater-dependent ecosystems across the region. That continuity may be the most useful place to leave the story. The names have changed, the explanations have changed, and the equipment used to enter the caves has changed dramatically, but people living on the peninsula are still dependent on water beneath the earth. Ancient Maya communities approached that hidden water through a cosmology involving sacred caves, gods, ancestors, death, fertility, and underworld powers. Modern hydrologists approach it through measurements of flow, salinity, chemistry, geology, and groundwater recharge. Cave divers carry computers and breathing equipment into passages where Maya ritual specialists once carried fire, ceramics, incense, and offerings. Archaeologists enter the same darkness looking for traces of ceremonies that ended centuries ago. When we return to the stories of Xibalba after seeing the physical landscape, they no longer need to sound like descriptions invented in complete isolation from the world around them. Maya storytellers lived in a region where the earth genuinely opened beneath people's feet, where water moved through invisible routes, where caves continued beyond the reach of daylight, and where some of the most important resources for life came from below. Their supernatural explanations belong to their own religious traditions, but the landscape that helped make those explanations convincing was entirely real. The hero twins could travel downward because downward travel was something Maya people understood physically. Gods could be associated with caves because caves were places humans could enter while never knowing their full extent. Offerings could be sent below because objects placed in deep caves and cenotes genuinely disappeared from ordinary human circulation. Death and fertility could meet underground because bodies entered the earth while water and crops emerged from it. Once those connections are understood, the Maya underworld becomes less mysterious without becoming less interesting. Somewhere beneath the forests and communities of Yucatan, water is still moving through those passages now. It passes through cracks that existed before the first Maya cities were built, and chambers that had already been forming long before any human being entered them. It moves past stone formations, submerged tunnels, archaeological remains, and living organisms adapted to darkness. Above it, people continue with ordinary life, often unaware of the exact route the water takes beneath them. That's probably the clearest answer to why the underworld felt real. The Maya did not have to imagine that the ground concealed something vast. They could see its entrances. They could descend into part of it. They could drink water that came from it. They could place offerings inside it and watch those offerings disappear beyond reach. What they could not see was where the hidden landscape ended, and modern exploration has shown that in some places it extends much farther than an ancient visitor could possibly have known. So when we picture a Maya person standing at the edge of a cenote, it is worth resisting the temptation to divide the scene too neatly into fact on one side and belief on the other. The limestone was real, the water was real, the cave was real, the ceremony was real, and the religious meaning was real to the people performing it. The supernatural beings belong to Maya cosmology, while the doorway belonged to the physical landscape. Those two things met at the same place, at an opening where daylight stopped and another environment began, and beneath that opening the hidden rivers of Yucatan continued through the rock, whether anyone above could see them or not.